Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most misunderstood places, the Ottoman Imperial Harem. But forget everything you think you know, because this was not a prison, it was not a pleasure palace, it was a school, a battlefield, a ladder to the stars. And for over 150 years, the women who walked its marble corridors did not just survive, they ruled one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. From slave girls captured in distant lands to empresses who decided the fate of nations, these women rewrote the rules. And tonight, we start at the beginning. So before we step through those palace doors together, I have a small favour to ask. If you enjoy the stories I bring you, if they help you relax or learn something new, or just drift off into a peaceful sleep, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. And I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked into bed in Texas? Listening from your apartment in London? Maybe driving home after a long shift? Drop a comment and let me know where you are in the world as we share this moment. Now, dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a little gentle white noise. Get comfortable. And let us walk together into a world that history almost forgot. Picture this. It is the year 1537. Somewhere in the rolling green hills of what is now Ukraine, a young girl with striking red hair is going about her day. Maybe she is drawing water from a well. Maybe she's helping her mother with the washing. Her name, her real name, will soon be forgotten. Because within days Tatar raiders will sweep through her village. She will be captured, chains will be locked around her wrists, and she will be sold in the slave markets of Istanbul to the most powerful man on earth. She has no idea that one day she'll become Hürrem Sultan. She has no idea that she will marry a sultan and break a 300-year tradition. She has no idea that she will become so powerful that a Venetian ambassador will say there has never been a woman in Ottoman history who held more authority. Right now, she is just a terrified girl being torn away from everything she has ever known. And she is not alone, because across the vast Ottoman Empire, from the shores of Greece to the mountains of the Caucasus, from Venetian trading ports to Bosnian villages, other girls are being captured, bought, or sometimes even sent as diplomatic gifts. They arrive at the gates of Topkapi Palace with nothing. No family, no status, no future, just their wits and whatever beauty or talent they were born with. This is how the Ottoman Imperial Harem worked. And here is the strange part, the part that history books often miss. For these girls, this was not necessarily the end of their story. Sometimes it was the beginning. Let me take you inside those palace walls. The harem was not one room. It was an entire complex, a city within a city, tucked into the right wing of Topkapi Palace, just behind where the Imperial Council met. Hundreds of rooms, courtyards with fountains, gardens with roses and nightingales, marble baths where steam rose in the morning light, and everywhere the sound of footsteps. Whispers, the rustle of silk. When a new girl arrived, she entered as what they called an asemi, a novice. Her old name? Gone. Her old life? Erased. She would be given a new name, usually something poetic in Persian or Turkish. Dilfirib, which means heart-stealing. Gulruh, which means rose-faced. Mahpeika, which means moon-like face. These were not just names, they were identities, new beginnings, and then her education would begin. Now, when I say education, I do not mean they handed her a broom and said good luck. The Ottoman harem was essentially a finishing school for young women, one of the most exclusive and rigorous in the world. These girls were taught to read and write in Ottoman Turkish. They learned mathematics. They studied the Quran and the principles of Islam. They learned music, how to play the oud, the tambur, the kanun. They learned poetry so they could compose verses that would make a sultan weep. They learned embroidery so fine it looked like paintings. They learned how to walk with grace, how to sit with elegance, how to enter a room and command attention without saying a word. Think about that for a moment. We are talking about the 16th and 17th centuries here. In most of Europe, even noble women received limited education. Reading was often considered unnecessary for girls. Universities? Forget it. But in the Ottoman harem, enslaved girls who'd been captured or bought, were being trained at a level that rivaled the education of male pages in the palace school. Why? Because the empire needed them. Not just as mothers to future sultans, though that was important, but as political operators, as diplomats, as advisors, as regents when necessary. The Ottomans understood something that many other civilizations did not. If you are going to place power in the hands of women, you'd better make sure they are educated enough to wield it. And there was a clear path upward. After her initial training, a girl would usually become a carrier, a servant. She would attend to the needs of the sultan's family and the higher-ranking women. But if she was smart, if she was skilled, if she was loyal, she could rise. She could become a kalfa, a supervisor, managing a section of the palace. And if she was truly exceptional, she could reach the rank of usta, a mistress. The highest of these was the hazinadar usta, the chief treasurer of the harem, who controlled enormous sums of money and wielded administrative power that would make a modern CEO jealous. But that was the path of service. There was another path, a more dangerous path, a path that led straight to the sultan himself. If a girl caught the eye of the sultan through her beauty, yes, but also through her intelligence, her wit, her ability to make him laugh or think or feel understood, she could become one of his favourites. And if she bore him a child, especially a son, she would be elevated to the rank of Kadın Effendi, one of the sultan's official consorts. Her future would be secure, her influence would grow, and if she played her cards right, if she was clever and patient and ruthless when necessary, she could rise even higher. She could become a Haseki Sultan, the chief consort, the favourite above all others. This was the title that Hürrem Sultan claimed when she became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1534. It was the first time in Ottoman history that a sultan had married a slave girl. The scandal rocked the empire. But the ultimate prize, the position of absolute power in the harem, was not Haseki. It was Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. If your son sat on the throne, you became the most powerful woman in the empire. Sometimes you became the most powerful person in the empire, period. Especially if your son was young, or weak, or uninterested in politics. Then you could become regent, the ruler in all but name. And that is exactly what happened during the period historians call the Sultanate of Women, which lasted from about 1534 to 1683. For 150 years, the empire was shaped by women who had arrived in chains. Let that sink in for a moment. These were women who had nothing, who had been stolen from their homes, who had every reason to give up, but instead they learned the system. They mastered it, and then they bent it to their will. Now, I want to be clear about something. This was not a fairy tale. The harem was not a magical place where dreams came true. It was brutal. It was competitive. For every woman who rose to power, there were hundreds who did not, who spent their lives in service and then were married off to minor officials or lived out their days in quiet obscurity. And even for those who did rise, the cost was high. You had to watch your back constantly. Poison was not uncommon. Political enemies did not just disappear. They were strangled, exiled, or worse. If you had a son, you had to protect him from fratricide, the old Ottoman practice where a new sultan would execute all his brothers to secure the throne. Imagine loving your children and knowing that if one becomes sultan, he might have to kill the others. That was the world these women navigated. But here is the thing, despite all of that, despite the danger, despite the competition, despite the fact that they were technically enslaved, these women built something. They created networks of power that stretched across the empire and beyond. They corresponded with foreign monarchs. They influenced the appointment of grand viziers. They funded the construction of mosques, hospitals, schools, soup kitchens, institutions that still stand in Istanbul today. They were not just surviving, they were thriving, they were leading. And the way they did it was through education, through intelligence, through understanding that in a world where men held the formal titles, real power could be found in the whispers behind the screen, the advice given in private, the alliances forged in secret. Compare this to Europe for a moment. If you were a peasant girl in France or England in the 1500s, what were your options? You could marry a farmer and spend your life working the land. You could enter a convent. Maybe, if you were very lucky, you could work as a servant in a noble household. But becoming queen, influencing foreign policy, building monuments, impossible. You would need to be born royal. But in the Ottoman Empire, a girl from a tiny village in Ukraine could become Hürrem Sultan. A girl from Venice could become Nurbanu Sultan and correspond with Catherine de' Medici. A girl from Greece could become Kösem Sultan and rule as regent for nearly 3 decades. Their origins did not matter. What mattered was what they made of themselves once they entered those palace gates. Of course, there were rules, strict rules. The harem was a carefully controlled space. Men could not enter, except for the sultan, young princes, and the eunuchs who served as guards and administrators. And yes, those eunuchs were a fascinating part of the system. We will talk more about them later. But for now, just know that they were not villains. They were often the most trusted confidants of the powerful women, the ones who carried messages to the outside world, who negotiated on their behalf, who protected their interests. And then there were the Kiras, the Jewish women who served as agents and intermediaries. Because remember, the women of the harem were secluded. They could not just walk into the city and conduct business. So they relied on these Kiras to be their eyes, their ears, their voices in the outside world. The Kiras would deliver letters to foreign ambassadors. They would handle financial transactions. They would gather intelligence. They were absolutely essential to the political power these women wielded. It was a complex system, a strange system by our modern standards, but it was also a system that worked. For over a century and a half, the women of the harem shaped the destiny of millions, and it all started with education, with the understanding that knowledge is power, that a well-trained mind can open doors that brute force never could. Think about Hürrem Sultan again. She did not just win Suleiman's heart with her beauty, she won it with her intelligence. Sources tell us that he was captivated by her wit, by her ability to discuss politics and poetry with equal skill. She advised him on matters of state. She wrote letters to foreign rulers. She was his partner, not just his concubine. And when she died in 1558, she left behind a legacy that would shape the empire for generations, because she had shown that it was possible, that a woman could rise from nothing and become everything. The women who came after her, Nurbanu, Safiye, Kösem, Turhan, they all walked the path she had paved. They all understood that in the Ottoman system there was a ladder, and if you were smart enough, tough enough, patient enough, you could climb it all the way to the top. So when we talk about the Ottoman harem, we're not talking about a prison. We are talking about a political institution, a training ground, a place where power was taught, learned, and seized. It was strange. It was brutal. It was unfair in 1,000 different ways. But it was also a place where extraordinary women did extraordinary things. And over the next 11 parts of this series, we are going to meet them. We are going to walk with them through palace intrigues and power struggles. We are going to see them negotiate with queens and emperors. We are going to watch them build monuments that still stand today. We are going to witness their triumphs and their tragedies. But tonight, we started with the foundation, with the system itself, with the understanding that the harem was not what we have been led to believe. It was so much more. And the women who lived there, they were not victims waiting to be rescued. They were players in the greatest game of power the world has ever seen. So rest easy tonight, knowing that history is full of surprises, that even in the most restrictive systems, brilliant minds find ways to lead, that education, intelligence, and sheer determination can overcome almost anything. And when you wake up, we will continue this journey together. Because next, we're going to meet the woman who started it all. The red-haired slave girl from Ukraine who became Kösem Sultan, the laughing one. The woman who changed an empire forever. Her story is one of love and ambition, strategy and scandal, and you are not going to want to miss it. Sweet dreams, my friends. And remember, power takes many forms. Sometimes it comes in chains. Sometimes it rises from nothing, and sometimes it changes the world. Now, let me tell you about the woman who broke every rule in the book and somehow got away with it. Her name was Roxolana. At least that is what the Europeans called her. In the palace, they called her Hürrem, which means the cheerful one, or the laughing one. And that nickname tells you something important about her. In a world of intrigue and danger, where one wrong move could mean exile or death. This woman smiled. She laughed. She made the most powerful man in the world fall so deeply in love with her that he did something no Ottoman Sultan had done in 300 years. He married her. Let us go back to that moment when she arrived at the palace. The year is around 1520. She is maybe 15 or 16 years old. Her real name, Alexandra or Anastasia, we are not entirely sure, has already been taken from her. She has been given to Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier and best friend of Sultan Suleiman, who presents her as a gift to the young Sultan. Imagine being in her position. You are in a strange city where you do not speak the language. You are surrounded by hundreds of other beautiful young women, all competing for the attention of one man. You have no family, no wealth, no status. The only things you have are your wits and whatever charm you were born with. What would you do? Hürrem looked around and realized something crucial. Yes, she was beautiful. Sources describe her as having striking red hair, pale skin, and eyes that sparkled with intelligence. But beauty alone would not be enough. The harem was full of beautiful women. Some of them had been there for years, already skilled in the arts of the palace, already fluent in Turkish, already familiar with the complex social dynamics. So Hürrem did something smart. She made Suleiman laugh. There are accounts, perhaps embellished, perhaps not, that describe her sense of humour. She would tease the Sultan gently. She would tell him stories. She would challenge him intellectually in ways that other women did not dare. And Suleiman, who had the weight of an empire on his shoulders, who spent his days making life and death decisions, found himself relaxing in her presence. He gave her the name Hürrem because she brought joy into his life. But do not mistake joy for simplicity. Hürrem was playing a long game, and the first move in that game was to give Suleiman a son. In 1521 she gave birth to Mehmed, and just like that, everything changed. She was no longer just another concubine. She was the mother of a potential heir. She had a stake in the future of the dynasty, and according to the traditions of the time, she should have been satisfied with that. She should have raised her son quietly, perhaps moved to a provincial governorship with him when he came of age, and lived out her days in comfortable obscurity. Hürrem had other plans. Over the next several years, she gave Suleiman 4 more sons and a daughter. 5 sons! Do you understand what that meant in the Ottoman system? It meant she had drastically increased her odds, because somewhere among those 5 boys there would be a sultan. And when that son took the throne, she would become Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. But there was a problem, a significant problem. Her name was Mahidevran. Mahidevran was Suleiman's first concubine, and she'd already given him a son, Mustafa, who was older than any of Hürrem's boys. By tradition, by birth order, by every logical calculation, Mustafa should inherit the throne, which meant Mahidevran, not Hürrem, would become Valide Sultan. And this is where the story gets dark, because the Ottoman Empire had a brutal solution to the problem of succession. It was called fratricide. When a new sultan took the throne, he would execute all his brothers to prevent civil war. It was codified in law. It was considered necessary for the stability of the empire, which meant that if Mustafa became sultan, Hürrem's 5 sons would die. All of them. Think about that. You're a mother of 5 boys. You love them. You've spent years raising them, educating them, preparing them for life. And you absolutely know, that if things go the way they're supposed to go, they will all be strangled with a silk cord. What would you do? How far would you go to protect your children? Hürrem went very, very far. First, she consolidated her position with Suleiman. She became indispensable to him, not just as a lover, but as an advisor. We have evidence that she discussed politics with him. Foreign ambassadors noted that she had influence over his decisions. The Venetian ambassador Bernardo Navigero wrote that there had never been in the history of the Ottoman house a lady who held more authority. Never. In 300 years. But influence was not enough. Hürrem needed something more, something unprecedented. She needed to become Suleiman's legal wife. Now, this might not sound shocking to you. A sultan marrying the mother of his children? What is so unusual about that? But in the Ottoman system, it was revolutionary. Sultans did not marry. They kept concubines specifically because it prevented any woman from gaining too much power through a formal marriage alliance. A wife had rights, a wife had status. A concubine, no matter how favoured, was still technically a slave. But in 1534, Suleiman married Hürrem. The scandal was enormous. Religious scholars objected. Courtiers whispered. Some historians believe that Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier, who had originally given Hürrem to Suleiman, opposed the marriage. Interestingly, Ibrahim Pasha was executed in 1536. Was Hürrem involved? We cannot know for certain. But she had already demonstrated that she was willing to do whatever it took to protect her position, and with the marriage she gained something crucial, legitimacy. She was no longer Hürrem the concubine, she was Kösem Sultan, the legal wife of the greatest ruler on earth. But she still had the Mustafa problem. Here is where the story becomes murky, because we are dealing with palace intrigue from 500 years ago, and the sources are biased, incomplete and often contradictory. But what we know is this. Over the years, Hürrem worked to undermine Mustafa's position. She allied herself with the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, who conveniently was married to her daughter Mihrimah. Together they whispered doubts into Suleiman's ear. Was Mustafa becoming too popular with the army? Was he growing impatient for the throne? Could he be planning a rebellion? In 1553, Suleiman summoned Mustafa to his tent during a military campaign. Mustafa entered. He never came out alive. He was strangled by mute executioners while his father sat on the other side of a screen. The sources say that Hürrem was behind it, that she orchestrated the whole thing. Others argue that Suleiman made the decision himself, that he genuinely believed Mustafa posed a threat. We will never know the complete truth. What we do know is that with Mustafa gone, Hürrem's sons were safe. Her path to becoming Valide Sultan was clear. Except for one small problem. Hürrem died in 1558, 8 years before Suleiman. She never got to be Valide Sultan. She never got to see her son Selim II take the throne in 1566. But in a way, that does not matter, because what Hürrem accomplished was bigger than any single title. She changed the system itself. Before Hürrem, the harem was kept at arm's length from politics. Concubines stayed in the background. They raised their sons and did not interfere. But Hürrem brought the harem into the palace proper. She brought it into the political sphere. She demonstrated that a woman could be a partner to the sultan, not just a possession. And she used her power for more than just personal gain. Hürrem was a prolific builder. She commissioned mosques, schools, hospitals, and soup kitchens across the empire. In Istanbul alone, she built a complex that included a mosque, a madrasa, a public kitchen, and a hospital. In Mecca, she funded the construction of 2 large public kitchens that fed pilgrims. In Jerusalem, she established a foundation to provide food for the poor. Why did she do all this? Partly it was piety. She was a devout Muslim. Partly it was politics. These projects employed thousands of workers and generated goodwill among the common people. But I think it was also legacy. Hürrem knew that she had risen from nothing. She knew that her story was extraordinary, and she wanted to leave something behind that would last longer than her own life. Those buildings are still standing today. You can visit them in Istanbul. You can see the gorgeous Iznik tiles, the elegant arches, the gardens where fountains still play. And when you stand there, you are standing in the presence of a woman who rewrote the rules. But here is the complicated part. Here is where history gets messy. Because while Hürrem was undeniably brilliant, while she was undeniably powerful, she was also, possibly, probably, responsible for the death of an innocent man. Mustafa, by most accounts, was a good person. He was beloved by the army. He was competent and intelligent, and he was killed, at least in part, because Hürrem saw him as a threat to her own children. Was she a villain? A hero? A mother protecting her sons? A ruthless politician eliminating rivals? The answer is probably all of the above. History is not a fairy tale with clear good guys and bad guys. It is complicated. It is full of people making impossible choices in impossible situations, and that is what makes Hürrem's story so fascinating. She was not perfect. She was not always admirable. But she was undeniably extraordinary. She took a system designed to keep women powerless and turned it into a ladder. She climbed that ladder all the way to the top, and then she held the door open for the women who came after her. Because after Hürrem, it became normal for sultans to be influenced by their wives and mothers. It became expected. The Sultanate of Women, that 150-year period when women shaped the empire, would not have happened without her. Think about Nurbanu Sultan, who came after her. Nurbanu corresponded with Catherine de' Medici of France. She sat in on council meetings. She co-ruled the empire with the Grand Vizier. Would she have been able to do any of that if Hürrem had not paved the way? Probably not. Or think about Kösem Sultan, who would become regent 3 different times and rule for nearly 3 decades. Kösem stood on Hürrem's shoulders. They all did. And that is Hürrem's real legacy. Not the buildings, as impressive as they are. Not the sons she bore, although they mattered. Her real legacy was proving that it could be done. That a slave girl with nothing but her intelligence and her courage could become the most powerful woman in the empire. She showed that the rules could be bent. And once you know the rules can be bent, they can never quite go back to the way they were before. So when you think about Hürrem Sultan, do not think about a villain or a victim. Think about a revolutionary. Someone who looked at the world as it was and decided it needed to change. Someone who fought with every weapon she had. beauty, intelligence, humour, political cunning, and yes, ruthlessness when necessary, to protect herself and the people she loved. Was she perfect? No. But she was real, she was human, and she was remarkable. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to remember something. Hürrem started with nothing. Absolutely nothing. She was a captive from a village whose name we do not even know, but she ended up changing the course of history, which means that no matter where you start, no matter how impossible the odds seem, there is always a way forward. There is always a ladder. You just have to be brave enough to climb it. Rest well, my friends, because when we continue, we are going to meet Hürrem's daughter, Mihrimah Sultan, the only child of Hürrem and Suleiman buried beside her father. She was born into royalty, which means she had advantages her mother never had. But as we will discover, being born with power and earning power are two very different things, and Mihrimah had to navigate her own treacherous path, one that would involve love, architecture, political intrigue, and two of the most beautiful mosques ever built. Her story is waiting for us just on the other side of your dreams. There is something uniquely powerful about being born into royalty versus clawing your way to it. And Mihrimah Sultan knew both sides of that coin better than almost anyone in history. She was born in 1522, the only daughter of Hürrem Sultan and Suleiman the Magnificent, which meant that from the moment she took her first breath, she was a princess of the most powerful empire on earth. She never knew slavery, she never knew poverty, she never had to fight for the Sultan's attention because the Sultan was her father and he adored her. Her name, Mihrimah, means sun and moon in Persian, and that name would become more significant than anyone could have imagined. But here is the interesting thing about Mihrimah. She had every advantage her mother never had: security, status, education from birth, access to power from day one, and yet in some ways her path was just as treacherous. Because when you are born with power, people expect you to keep it, and the higher you start, the farther you can fall. Let me paint you a picture of what Mihrimah's childhood looked like. She grew up in Topkapi Palace during its golden age. Her father was Suleiman the Magnificent, not just a title, but an accurate description. During his reign, the Ottoman Empire reached its peak. It stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, from the coast of Algeria to the mountains of Iran. Suleiman was a lawgiver, a poet, a patron of the arts, and a military genius, and he absolutely doted on his daughter. We have records showing that Suleiman showered Mihrimah with gifts, with attention, with opportunities. She received the finest education available, not just in the arts and music like other palace women, but in literature, mathematics, and politics. She learned multiple languages, she studied poetry and could compose verses that would make grown men weep. But more importantly, she learned how power actually works. Because she had the best teacher imaginable, her mother, Hürrem. Can you imagine those conversations? Hürrem, who had fought her way up from nothing, teaching her daughter, who had everything, how to navigate the deadly currents of palace politics. It must have been fascinating. Hürrem knew every trick, every strategy, every pressure point in the system, and she passed all of that knowledge on to Mihrimah. But knowledge is only useful if you have the opportunity to use it, and that opportunity came in the form of a marriage proposal. In 1539, when Mihrimah was just 17 years old, her mother arranged for her to marry Rustam Pasha. Now this was not some romantic love match, this was strategy. Rustam was the governor of Diyarbakir at the time, but he was brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely loyal to Hürrem. More importantly, he was on track to become Grand Vizier, the second most powerful position in the entire empire. Think about what Hürrem was doing here. She was creating a power triangle, Suleiman at the top, Rustam as Grand Vizier handling the day-to-day administrations of the empire, and Mihrimah as the connection between them, daughter of one, wife of the other. Information would flow through this triangle. Decisions would be made. Enemies would be crushed. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And it worked. Rustam became Grand Vizier in 1544, just 5 years after marrying Mihrimah, and for the next 17 years, until his death in 1561, he was one of the most powerful men in the empire. But here is the question. Was he powerful because of his own abilities, or because he had Mihrimah and Hürrem behind him? The answer is probably both. Rustam was genuinely talented. He was an excellent administrator and a shrewd politician, but having the backing of the Sultan's wife and daughter certainly did not hurt his career. In fact, there were times when that backing saved his life. There is a famous incident in the 1553, the same year that Mustafa was executed, where Rustam was briefly dismissed from his position as Grand Vizier. The reasons are complex and involve palace intrigue that we do not fully understand, but what we do know is that Mihrimah and Hürrem fought for him. They lobbied Suleiman. They used every ounce of their influence. And in 1555, Rustam was reinstated. The Venetian ambassador at the time noted that the empire was effectively being governed by 3 people: the Sultan, his wife, and his daughter, not the Grand Vizier, not the military commanders, 3 members of one family. That is dynasty building at its finest. But Mihrimah was more than just a political operator working behind the scenes. She was also a patron of architecture on a scale that would make most rulers jealous. And this is where her story becomes truly beautiful, literally. Between 1562 and 1565, Mihrimah commissioned 2 mosques in Istanbul. Both were designed by Mimar Sinan, who was quite possibly the greatest architect the Islamic world has ever produced. Sinan had already built masterpieces for Suleiman and for Hürrem, but what he created for Mihrimah was something special. The first mosque is in Üsküdar, on the Asian side of Istanbul, right by the water. It is elegant and intimate, with a single dome and a slender minaret. When you sit in its courtyard, you can watch the boats drift by on the Bosphorus, and the whole city seems to unfold before you. The second mosque is at Edirnekepe, on the European side, up on one of the 7 hills of Istanbul. This one is grander, more imposing, with its dome seeming to float above the city. From up there you can see for miles. You can see the Golden Horn, the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara. You feel like you are standing on top of the world. 2 mosques, 2 sides of the city, sun and moon, and here is where legend and architecture blend into something magical. There is a story, a beautiful story that may or may not be true, that Mimar Sinan was in love with Mihrimah, that he designed these 2 mosques as a declaration of his feelings, and that on the spring equinox, March 21st, something extraordinary happens. On that day, the sun sets behind the Edirnekepe Mosque on the European side just as the full moon rises behind the Üsküdar Mosque on the Asian side. Sun and moon, Mihrimah. The 2 mosques align with the celestial bodies of her name. Is it true? Did Sinan really plan it that way? Or is it just a coincidence that generations of romantics have turned into legend? Honestly, it does not matter, because whether it was intentional or not, those 2 mosques stand as monuments to a woman who understood that power comes in many forms. Political power, yes, but also cultural power, architectural power, the power to shape a city's skyline and its soul. And unlike political alliances, which shift with the wind, unlike marriages which end with death, those mosques are still standing today. More than 450 years later, people still pray in them, still marvel at them, still tell stories about the princess and the architect and the sun and the moon. That is legacy. But Mihrimah's story was not all poetry and beautiful buildings. After Rustam died in 1561, her political influence began to wane. Her father was aging. Her mother had already been dead for 3 years. Her brothers were competing for succession, and when Suleiman finally died in 1566, her brother Selim II took the throne. Now, Mihrimah and Selim had a complicated relationship. They were siblings, yes, but they had different mothers' ambitions, different circles of influence. Selim's mother-in-law was Nurbanu Sultan. Remember that name? We will talk much more about her soon. And Nurbanu had her own ideas about how the empire should be run. Mihrimah tried to maintain her influence during Selim's reign. She had experience, she had knowledge, she had been at the centre of power for her entire life. But there is a fundamental difference between being the Sultan's daughter and being the Sultan's sister. One commands reverence and access. The other is just a family member. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mihrimah found herself being edged out. Not exiled, not disgraced, just sidelined. She still had her palaces, she still had her wealth, she still had her mosques, but the power, the real tangible political power she had wielded for decades, that was slipping away. And here is what I find so poignant about Mihrimah's later years. She continued her charitable work, she continued to commission buildings, to support artists and scholars, to fund public works. But there is a sense, reading the historical accounts, that she knew her time had passed. The Sultanate of Women was entering a new phase, and it would be dominated by women like Nurbanu and Safiye, women who had clawed their way up from nothing, just like Hürrem had. Mihrimah died in 1578, at the age of 56. And here is the detail that makes me pause every time I think about it. She is the only one of Suleiman's children, the only one out of 6, who is buried next to him, not in a separate tomb, not in some distant location, right there, in the mausoleum behind the Suleymaniye Mosque. What does that tell you? It tells you that despite everything, despite the political intrigues, despite the shifting alliances, despite the fact that her brothers fought bitter civil wars over succession, Suleiman's bond with his daughter remained special. Even in death, he wanted her close. And when you visit that mausoleum today, when you stand in that quiet, sacred space with its gorgeous Iznik tiles and filtered sunlight, you are standing in the presence of a unique relationship. A father and daughter who both held tremendous power, who both shaped the empire, who both left marks on history that time has not erased. So what do we learn from Mihrimah's story? What is different about her compared to her mother, Hürrem, all the women who had come after her? I think it is this. Mihrimah shows us that being born into power and earning power require different skills. Hürrem had to be ruthless, cunning, willing to do whatever it took to survive. She had nothing to lose because she started with nothing. But Mihrimah had everything to lose. She had status, reputation, family connections, which meant she had to be more careful, more diplomatic, more strategic about when to push and when to yield. She also shows us something about the nature of female power in a patriarchal system. Because even though Mihrimah had every advantage, royal birth, wealth, education, connections, her power was still fundamentally borrowed, came through the men in her life. Her father, her husband, her brothers. When those men were alive and supportive, she wielded enormous influence. But when they died or shifted their allegiance, what was left? The mosques, the charitable foundations, the buildings and institutions that carried her name and her vision forward. That was the power she could truly own. That was the legacy she could control. And maybe that is why she invested so much in architecture and charity. Because she understood on some level that political power is temporary, but cultural impact can be eternal. Compare Mihrimah to a European princess of the same era. Let us say one of Henry VIII's daughters in England. They had power, yes, but it was entirely dependent on marriage or inheritance. They could not commission grand mosques. They could not sit in on council meetings. They could not marry their way into the position of Queen Mother and rule as regent. The Ottoman system, for all its flaws and restrictions, actually gave women like Mihrimah more room to operate than most European systems did. It was still a patriarchal system, still limiting, still frustrating in countless ways, but there was space, narrow space, carefully guarded space, where a smart, determined woman could build something lasting. And Mihrimah built beautifully. Those two mosques, one intimate and waterside, one grand and elevated, they still define Istanbul's skyline. They still call the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. They still stand as proof that a woman's vision can shape a city for centuries. So as you close your eyes tonight, picture those two mosques. Picture the sun setting behind one just as the moon rises behind the other. Picture a princess who was born with the sun and moon in her name, who turned that poetry into stone and light and sacred space, who understood that some kinds of power fade, but beauty and faith and architecture can outlast empires. Mihrimah's story reminds us that legacy is a choice. You can chase political power, which is important but fragile, or you can build something that will stand long after you are gone. Ideally, you do both. You use your political power to build something beautiful. You turn influence into institutions. You make sure that even when your name is forgotten, your impact remains. Sweet dreams, my friends. And when we continue, we're going to meet the woman who came after Mihrimah, a woman who could not have been more different. Nurbanu Sultan started exactly where Hürrem started, as a captured slave. But while Hürrem broke the rules through marriage and passion, Nurbanu played the game with cold, calculated brilliance. She corresponded with queens. She hid her husband's corpse in a box of ice to buy time for her son. She became one of the most successful diplomats the Ottoman Empire ever had, and the mystery of her true identity, was she Venetian, Greek, Jewish, still puzzles historians today. Her story is waiting just beyond the edge of sleep. Sometimes the most powerful people in history are the ones who remain mysterious, and nobody embodied that paradox quite like Nurbanu Sultan. To this day, more than 400 years after her death, historians still argue about who she really was. Was she Cecilia Venier Baffo, the illegitimate daughter of 2 noble Venetian families? Was she Kale Kartanu, a Greek girl from Corfu? Some Turkish historians even claim she was Jewish, a woman named Rachel. The truth is, we may never know for certain. And in a strange way, that mystery was part of her power. Because when people do not know exactly who you are, they cannot predict what you will do. They cannot use your past against you. You become whoever you need to be in the moment. And Nurbanu needed to be many different things to many different people over her 58 years of life. Let us start with what we do know. Around 1537, when she was approximately 12 years old, a girl was captured, either by Ottoman raiders or by the infamous pirate Hayreddin Barbarossa during his campaigns in the Mediterranean. She was brought to Istanbul and eventually presented to Prince Selim, the son of Suleiman the Magnificent and Hürrem Sultan. Selim was not the eldest son. He was not the favourite. He spent most of his youth in provincial governorships, away from the glamour and danger of the capital. He was known more for his love of wine than his military prowess. History would later call him Selim the Drunkard, which tells you something about his priorities. He was not destined for greatness. But he had one advantage: he was still alive. And in the Ottoman succession system, sometimes that was enough. The young girl, let us call her Cecilia, though we cannot be sure, became Selim's concubine. And unlike Hürrem, who captivated Suleiman with laughter and passion, Nurbanu took a different approach. She was calm, calculating, patient. She gave Selim what he needed: stability, comfort, and children. Lots of children. She bore him a son, Murad, in 1546, then 3 daughters, Ismihan, Shah and Gevherhan. And here is the crucial part. Even though Selim had other concubines, Nurbanu remained his favourite. Not through drama or jealousy or passionate displays, but through consistency. She made herself indispensable, and she was smart enough to prepare for every possible future. Because in 1558, something unexpected happened. Selim's older brother Bayezid rebelled against their father Suleiman. It was a disaster. Bayezid was defeated, fled to Persia, and was eventually executed along with his sons, which meant that Selim, unremarkable, wine-loving Selim, was suddenly next in line for the throne. Can you imagine Nurbanu's thoughts at that moment? Everything had changed. Her son Murad was now a potential sultan. She was now a potential Valide Sultan. But first, Selim had to survive long enough to inherit. And then he had to live long enough for Murad to grow up. So Nurbanu started building her network. And this is where her possible Venetian heritage becomes fascinating. Because if she truly was from Venice, and the evidence strongly suggests she was, then she had something none of the other women in the harem had, a direct connection to one of the great powers of the Mediterranean. Venice and the Ottoman Empire had a complicated relationship. Sometimes they were allies, trading partners who enriched each other. Sometimes they were enemies, fighting brutal naval wars for control of the Mediterranean. But they always needed to talk to each other. They always needed intermediaries. And Nurbanu was perfectly positioned to be that bridge. When Selim became sultan in 1566, Nurbanu became Haseki Sultan. And when he died in 1574, there are rumours he died from a drunken fall in a bathhouse, which seems unfortunately plausible. She became Valide Sultan to her son Murad III. This was it. This was the position that Hürrem had worked for but never achieved. The position that gave a woman more power than almost anyone else in the empire. And Nurbanu intended to use every bit of that power. Here is what makes Nurbanu different from Hürrem. Hürrem was passionate, dramatic, willing to take enormous risks. She changed the system through sheer force of personality. But Nurbanu worked within the system. She understood that the most effective power is often the quietest. She did not need grand gestures. She needed networks, information, and patience. One of her most important relationships was with her Kira, her Jewish agent, a woman named Esther Handels. Now, we talked briefly about Kiras in the first part, but let me explain why they were so crucial. The women of the harem could not just walk into the city and conduct business. They could not meet with foreign ambassadors. They could not negotiate trade deals or gather intelligence. They needed representatives. And Jewish women who operated outside both the Muslim and Christian power structures were perfectly positioned for this role. Esther Handley was Nurbanu's eyes, ears, and voice in the outside world. She delivered letters, she met with diplomats, she handled financial transactions. She gathered information about what was happening in the city, in the empire, in foreign courts. And because she was trusted by Nurbanu, she became one of the most powerful women in Istanbul, even though most people have never heard of her. Through Esther, Nurbanu maintained contact with Venice. She exchanged letters with the Doge. She received gifts, expensive fabrics, jewels, rare books, and she used this relationship to influence Ottoman foreign policy in a pro-Venetian direction, which, as you might imagine, did not make everyone happy. The Republic of Genoa, Venice's bitter rival, absolutely hated Nurbanu. They saw her as a Venetian agent working against their interests from inside the Ottoman court. And some historians believe that when Nurbanu died suddenly in 1583, it was not natural causes, it was poison, administered by Genoese agents who were tired of her interference. We cannot prove it, but we cannot disprove it either. And that is how things worked in the 16th century. If you had power, you had enemies. and if you had enemies, you had to watch what you ate. But let us back up a bit, because we are getting ahead of the story. During the 9 years when Nurbanu was Valide Sultan, from 1574 to 1583, she was not just engaging in foreign policy. She was also managing a much more immediate problem, her son Murad III. Murad was 28 when he became Sultan, which was old enough to rule on his own, but here is the thing, he did not want to. Or rather, he wanted the title and the luxury, but not the actual work of governing. He was perfectly happy to let his mother handle things, and handle things she did. A Venetian ambassador named Paolo Contarini wrote in 1583 that the empire was more and more governed by the two sultanas, meaning Nurbanu and another woman we will talk about very soon. He noted that Murad relied primarily on his mother's counsel, believing he could never obtain more affectionate and faithful advice than hers. Think about what that means. The Ottoman Empire at this time stretched across 3 continents. It had perhaps 30 million people. It had the most powerful military in the Mediterranean, and major decisions were being made by a woman who had started life as a captured 12-year-old girl. That is not just personal triumph, that is institutional power. But Nurbanu did more than just advise her son. She also co-ruled with the Grand Vizier, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha, who was one of the most capable administrators the empire ever had. They formed a partnership, the Valide Sultan and the Grand Vizier, working together to keep the empire stable, while Murad indulged himself in the pleasures of the Harem. And Nurbanu, like Hürrem and Mihrimah before her, was also a great builder. Her masterpiece was the Attic Valide Mosque complex in Üsküdar, completed by Mimar Sinan in 1583, the year of her death. It is massive. It includes not just a mosque, but a madrasa, a hospital, a public kitchen, a caravanserai, and a bathhouse. It was the largest complex ever built by a woman in the Ottoman Empire. When you visit it today, and it is still there, still functioning, still serving the community, you get a sense of Nurbanu's vision. This was not just about personal glory, this was about creating institutions that would outlast her. Schools to educate, hospitals to heal, kitchens to feed the poor, baths to provide hygiene and social space. She was building civil society one stone at a time, and here is something that often gets overlooked. These building projects were also economic engines. They employed thousands of workers, architects, engineers, stonemasons, carpenters, artists, craftsmen. They generated income through rents and fees that funded their charitable works in perpetuity. Nurbanu was not just giving charity, she was creating sustainable systems of support. That takes a completely different kind of intelligence than just wielding political power. It requires understanding economics, logistics, administration, long-term planning. It requires thinking beyond your own lifetime. But let us talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the woman in the harem, because there was someone who threatened everything Nurbanu had built. Someone who wanted Murad's attention and affection for herself. Someone who would prove to be Nurbanu's greatest rival and ultimately her successor. Her name was Safiye. Safiye had been given to Murad when he was still a prince, probably as a gift from Mihrimah Sultan. She was from Albania, beautiful and intelligent, and Murad fell deeply in love with her. So deeply that he did not want any other women. He made Safiye his Haseki, his chief consort, when he was still a prince, and when he became sultan she expected to have enormous influence. But there was a problem. Actually, there were 2 problems. First, Nurbanu was already Valide Sultan, and she had no intention of sharing power with her son's favourite concubine. She had worked too hard, come too far to let some young woman displace her. Second, and this was more serious, Safiye had only given Murad one son, Mehmed, born in 1566. Then, mysteriously, she could not seem to get pregnant again. She tried. According to the sources, she got pregnant several times over the years, but always miscarried or the baby died shortly after birth. Now, why was this a problem? Because the empire needed heirs, plural. If something happened to Mehmed, the dynasty could be in crisis, so Murad needed to have children with other women. But he did not want to. He loved Safiye. He was by some accounts unable to perform with anyone else. Can you see the disaster brewing here? On one side you have Nurbanu, the Valide Sultan, desperate to secure the dynasty by getting her son to have more children. On the other side you have Safiye, the beloved Haseki, who has Murad so completely devoted to her that he cannot or will not look at other women. And caught in the middle is Murad himself, torn between his mother and his love. Something had to give, and in 1582 it did. Nurbanu devised a plan, a cruel plan, but an effective one. She started a rumour that Safiye was using black magic, specifically that she had bewitched Murad to make him impotent with other women. Now, whether Nurbanu actually believed this or whether it was pure political calculation, we cannot know, but the rumour spread. It spread through the palace, through the city, through the empire, and Murad, whose pride was wounded by the suggestion that he could not perform, was faced with a choice. Defend Safiye and look weak, or exile her and prove his manhood? He chose exile. Safiye was sent to the old palace, away from Topkapi, away from Murad, away from power, and almost immediately Murad's impotence problem disappeared. He started having children with other concubines, lots of children. Over the next few years he fathered dozens of sons and daughters. Nurbanu had won, or so it seemed. But here is the thing about Safiye. She did not break. She did not give up. She waited. She had her son Mehmed, who openly disagreed with both Murad and Nurbanu for exiling his mother. Mehmed was the heir apparent, and he loved Safiye fiercely. He made it clear that when he became Sultan, his first act would be to bring his mother back to power. And Nurbanu, despite her political brilliance, could not solve this problem, because Mehmed was her grandson. She loved him. She did not want to harm him or turn him against her. But as long as he supported Safiye, Safiye remained a threat. The standoff lasted for years. Safiye in the old palace, Nurbanu in Topkapi, Mehmed caught between his grandmother and his mother, Murad trying to keep everyone happy and failing miserably. And then, in December 1583, Nurbanu died. Suddenly, mysteriously. Some say it was natural causes. She was in her late 50s, which was a good age for the time. Others say it was poison from Genoese agents. Still others whisper that maybe, just maybe, Safiye had her own networks, her own Kiras, her own supply of certain substances. We will never know the truth, but we know what happened next. Less than 2 years after Nurbanu's death, in early 1585, Safiye returned to the palace. Murad welcomed her back with open arms. She and her daughters were reinstated, and Safiye, who had spent years in exile, immediately began building her own power base. She had learned from watching Nurbanu. She understood now how the game was played. And when Murad died in 1595 and her son Mehmed III became Sultan, Safiye would become Valide Sultan herself, and she would be every bit as powerful as Nurbanu had been, maybe more so. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. For now, as you drift towards sleep, I want you to think about what Nurbanu's story teaches us. She shows us that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it works quietly through your letters and conversations, through networks and relationships. She shows us that being underestimated can be an advantage. Let people think you are just a woman in the harem, while you are actually conducting foreign policy with Venice. and she shows us that even the best laid plans can be undone by love, by family dynamics, by forces you cannot control. Nurbanu built an empire within an empire. She corresponded with queens and doges. She constructed monuments that still stand. She ruled alongside the Grand Vizier as an equal partner. But she could not defeat a younger woman who had the one thing she could not match, Murad's heart. And that is the tragedy and the complexity of the Sultanate of Women. These women wielded enormous power. They shaped empires, but their power was always mediated through men, through sons, through husbands, through the architecture of a patriarchal system. And when those personal relationships shifted, when love or death or rivalry intervened, even the strongest woman could fall. Rest now, my friends. Let these stories settle into your mind like dust after a storm. Because when we continue, we are going to dive deep into that conflict between Nurbanu and Safiye. We are going to explore the black magic scandal in detail, examine what it reveals about power and gender and politics in the 16th century. We are going to meet Safiye Sultan on her own terms, not as Nurbanu's rival, but as one of the most controversial, most enduring women in Ottoman history. A woman who survived 7 sultans. A woman who was called the cruelest of all the powerful women. A woman whose story will keep you awake if you are not careful. Sleep well. Accusations of witchcraft have destroyed countless women throughout history. But what happens when the accused woman refuses to stay destroyed? The year is 1582. Safiye Sultan, the beloved Haseki of Sultan Murad III, finds herself at the centre of a scandal that is sweeping through Istanbul like wildfire. The whispers started in the Harem, as these things always do, but they have spread to the streets, to the mosques, to the council chambers. People are saying she has bewitched the Sultan, that she has used black magic to make him impotent with other women, that she is endangering the entire dynasty for her own selfish purposes. And standing behind these whispers, orchestrating them with the precision of a master puppeteer, is her mother-in-law, Nurbanu Sultan, the Valide Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. This is not just palace gossip, this is a calculated political attack. And to understand why it happened, we need to go back to the beginning of Safiye's story. Safiye was born around 1550 in Dukagjini, Albania, or at least that is what most sources say. As with so many of these women, her origins are somewhat murky. What we know for certain is that she was captured as a child and brought to the Ottoman palace. According to some accounts, she was presented to Prince Murad by Mihrimah Sultan herself. Remember her from earlier? Suleiman's daughter? The princess with the sun and moon mosques? There is a fascinating theory that Mihrimah deliberately chose Safiye to create problems for Nurbanu, that she knew Murad would fall in love with this girl, and that this love would create tension in the harem. Was it revenge for some slight political manoeuvring, a power play between the old generation and the new? We cannot know, but it would be very much in character for the women of this era to play such long games. Regardless of how she arrived, Safiye entered Murad's life when she was about 13 years old and he was 16. They were both teenagers living in the provincial city of Manisa, where Murad served as governor, and something remarkable happened. They fell in love. Not the calculating attachment that Nurbanu had with Selim, not the passionate but strategic relationship that Hürrem had with Suleiman. This was young love, intense, consuming, exclusive. Murad did not want anyone else. And this, in the Ottoman system, was a massive problem. You see, a prince was supposed to have multiple concubines. He was supposed to father numerous children to ensure the continuation of the dynasty. The whole system was designed around this idea of abundance. Many mothers, many sons, many possible heirs. It was insurance against infant mortality, against disease, against the countless ways children could die in the 16th century. But Murad only wanted Safiye. He made her his Haseki, his chief consort, while he was still a prince, and together they had a son, Mehmed, born in 1566, a healthy boy, a potential sultan. Everything should have been perfect, except Safi did not get pregnant again. And this is where the story becomes genuinely mysterious and genuinely sad. Over the next 16 years, there are records suggesting she conceived multiple times. But each pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth or the infant dying within days. Can you imagine that pain? The hope, the loss, the hope again, the loss again, over and over. We do not know why this happened. Maybe it was just biology. Some women have trouble carrying pregnancies to term, if even today with all our medical knowledge. Maybe it was the stress of palace life. Maybe it was something else entirely. But the result was the same. Safiye had only one living son. And when Murad became sultan in 1574, this became a crisis. Because what if something happened to Mehmed? What if he got sick, had an accident, was assassinated? The entire dynasty rested on one 8-year-old boy. Nurbanu, the Valide Sultan, understood this danger perfectly. She needed Murad to have more sons, but Murad was apparently unable or unwilling to perform with other women. Multiple sources mention this problem. Some describe it delicately, others are more blunt. But they all agree. Murad was so devoted to Safiye that he could not be with anyone else. Now, put yourself in Nurbanu's position for a moment. You've spent your entire life climbing to this pinnacle of power. You are Valide Sultan. Your son is the ruler of one of the greatest empires on earth. But the entire dynasty, everything you have worked for, is threatened because your son cannot function sexually except with one specific woman. What do? If you are Nurbanu, you go to war. Not with swords, but with words, with rumours, with the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of patriarchal societies, the accusation of sexual witchcraft. The accusation was genius in its cruelty. By claiming that Safiye had bewitched Murad, Nurbanu accomplished several things at once. First, she provided a face-saving explanation for Murad's impotence. It was not his fault, you see. It were magic. Second, she turned Safiye's greatest strength, Murad's love for her, into evidence of wrongdoing. Of course he loved her unnaturally. She had enchanted him. Third, she tapped into deep cultural anxieties about female sexuality and power. Because let us be honest about what was happening here. Safiye had too much influence over the Sultan. She had his heart, his mind, his body. And in a system where women were supposed to be controlled, where their power was supposed to be mediated through men, a woman who had this kind of hold over a sultan was terrifying. It upset the natural order. It had to be explained as supernatural. And the accusation of black magic, of making Murad impotent through spells, was particularly devastating because it struck at the core of masculine identity. If the sultan could not perform with multiple women, if he could not father children freely, then what kind of sultan was he? The rumour questioned his manhood, his virility, his fitness to rule. Murad was trapped. If he defended Safiye, he looked weak, controlled by a woman, possibly bewitched. If he abandoned her, he lost the person he loved most in the world. There was no good option. He chose his pride. In 1582, Safiye was exiled to the old palace. Now the old palace was not a dungeon. It was actually quite comfortable. A residence for former concubines, retired servants, and family members who were no longer central to court life. But for someone like Safiye, who had been at the absolute centre of power, who had slept beside the Sultan every night for years, it might as well have been a prison. And the truly devastating part? It worked. Almost immediately after Safiye was gone, Murad's impotence problem disappeared. He started having relations with other concubines. He started fathering children. Over the next few years, he had dozens of children. Some sources say he fathered over 100 sons and daughters in total, though many died in infancy. So was Nurbanu right? Had Safiye really bewitched Murad? Or was this just a psychological issue? Murad's guilt about betraying Safiye making it impossible for him to be with other women while she was present. But once she was gone, that barrier disappeared. We will never know, but here's what I find fascinating. Safiye never confessed. She never admitted to using magic. She never recanted or apologized or begged for forgiveness. She went to the old palace with her head held high and waited, because Safiye understood something crucial. She understood that in the long game of palace politics, patience could be more powerful than passion. Yes, Nurbanu had won this round. Yet she was exiled, but she still had two advantages that no one could take away from her. First, she had Mehmed, her son, the heir to the throne, and Mehmed loved his mother fiercely. He was furious about her exile. He openly disagreed with Murad and Nurbanu about it. And everyone knew that when Mehmed became sultan, his first act would be to bring his mother back and elevate her to Valide Sultan. Second, she had time. Nurbanu was in her late 50s. Murad was in his 30s, but not particularly healthy. Safiye was still in her 30s, strong, patient, and absolutely determined. She could wait, she would wait, and eventually the wheel of fortune would turn. But the waiting must have been agony. Imagine being sent away from the man you love, accused of the most terrible crime imaginable in your society, stripped of your power and status, all because you could not bear more children, and then having to watch from a distance as your husband is with other women, fathers children with them, builds his life without you. Would you have broken? Would you have given up? Would you have accepted your fate and lived out your days in comfortable obscurity? Safiye did not break, and this is where we see the steel beneath the beauty, because during those years of exile from 1582 to 1585, Safiye did not just sit around feeling sorry for herself. She used the time. She built networks. She maintained contact with her supporters in the palace through trusted servants. She corresponded with her son. She prepared for her eventual return, and she understood something that Nurbanu perhaps did not fully appreciate. The black magic accusation, while politically effective, was also dangerous for Nurbanu, because if people believed that Safiye had that kind of power, the power to control a sultan through magic, then she became more fearsome, not less. She became someone to be reckoned with, someone who had secret knowledge, supernatural abilities, connections to forces beyond normal understanding. In some ways, the accusation made Safiye more powerful, not weaker. It made her legendary. And then, in December 1583, Nurbanu died. Suddenly, at age 58. And immediately the rumours started. Had Safiye cursed her from the old palace? Had Safiye's alleged magical powers reached out across Istanbul to strike down her enemy? Or was it simpler than that? Poison delivered by agents loyal to Safiye or to Venice's enemies? We do not know. We cannot know. But the timing was certainly convenient for Safiye, and it must have felt to the people of Istanbul like some kind of cosmic justice, like the universe was settling accounts. Within months of Nurbanu's death, Safiye was back. Murad welcomed her to Topkapı Palace in early 1585. She was reinstated as Kösem Sultan. Her daughters, who had been exiled with her, returned as well, and Safiye immediately began consolidating power. But here is what is remarkable. She did not seek revenge. She did not punish the people who had supported Nurbanu's accusations. She did not tear down Nurbanu's allies or try to erase her predecessor's legacy. Instead, she learned from Nurbanu. She studied how Nurbanu had wielded power. She built her own network of kiras, her own channels of communication with foreign courts, her own base of support among the palace officials. Because Safiye understood that the goal was not to defeat one rival, the goal was to build something lasting. And when Murad died in 1595, his health ruined by years of overindulgence, and her son Mehmed III became Sultan, Safiye became Valide Sultan. Finally, after all those years, after all that struggle, and she would hold that position for 8 years, until Mehmed's death in 1603. And even after that, she would remain a force in palace politics for another 16 years. She lived through the reign of her grandson, Ahmed I, through the brief troubled reign of Mustafa I, through the return of Ahmed I. She outlasted all of them. When she finally died in 1619, she had seen 7 sultans rule. 7. She'd entered the palace as a gift during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent and died during the reign of Osman II. She had spanned an entire era, and throughout all of it the whisper followed her. The woman who used magic. The woman who could control sultans. The woman who was so powerful that even exile could not destroy her. Was it true? Almost certainly not. The idea that Safiye had magical powers is absurd, but did Safiye encourage the rumour once Nurbanu was gone? Did she let people believe she was dangerous in ways beyond the political? Did she understand that being feared for supernatural reasons could be just as useful as being feared for natural ones? I think she probably did, because Safiye was nothing if not a strategist. She had learned from the best, from Nurbanu, from Hürrem, from Mihrimah. She had learned that in a world where women were not supposed to have power, you took power wherever you could find it, including in the fears and superstitions of your enemies. The black magic scandal teaches us something important about how accusations of witchcraft function. They are never really about magic. They are about power, about women who have too much of it, who threaten the existing order, who need to be brought down. The specific mechanism, love potions, curses, spells, does not really matter. What matters is the underlying message. This woman is dangerous, unnatural, transgressing her proper role. But here is the twist. Sometimes the accused woman can turn the accusation to her advantage. Sometimes being called a witch makes you more powerful, not less. Because now everyone knows you're not to be trifled with. Now everyone treats you with extra caution. Now you occupy a space of mystery and fear that can be just as effective as formal authority. Safiye understood this, and she used it. And in the end she outlived all her enemies and died peacefully in her bed, one of the most successful women in Ottoman history. So as you close your eyes tonight, think about resilience. Think about what it means to be knocked down and get back up. Think about Safiye, exiled and accused, waiting patiently in the old palace for her moment to return. Think about how 3 years of patience led to 34 years of power. Sometimes the battle is not won by fighting hardest, but by lasting longest. Sometimes survival is the greatest victory of all. Rest well, my friends. And when we continue, we are going to explore a relationship that might surprise you. The correspondence between Safiye Sultan and Queen Elizabeth I of England. 2 powerful women ruling in vastly different systems, reaching across the Mediterranean to build an alliance that would shape the politics of 3 continents. It is a story of diplomacy, gift-giving, international intrigue, and what happens when women decide to bypass the men around them and deal with each other directly. Sleep peacefully and let these stories of strength and strategy carry you into your dreams. Imagine 2 queens separated by thousands of miles and fundamentally different worlds, writing letters to each other. One sits in a palace overlooking the Bosphorus. the other sits in a drafty castle on the Thames. One commands an empire of 30 million people. The other rules an island kingdom still finding its footing on the world stage, and somehow, against all odds, they become allies. This is the story of Safiye Sultan and Elizabeth I, and it is one of the strangest diplomatic relationships in history. The year is 1593. Safiye has been Valide Sultan for about 3 years now, since her son Mehmed III took the throne. She is at the peak of her power, and she receives a letter not from another sultan, not from a grand vizier, but from a woman, a queen, Elizabeth I of England. Now, this might not sound particularly unusual to you. Queens write to each other all the time, right? But in the context of Ottoman politics, this was revolutionary, because Ottoman women did not typically engage in direct diplomatic correspondence with foreign rulers. That was men's work. That was the purview of the Sultan, the Grand Vizier, the Council. But Safiye was not a typical Ottoman woman, and Elizabeth was not a typical European queen. Both of them understood that sometimes the best way to get things done is to bypass all the men in the middle and talk directly into the person who actually makes decisions. Let me give you some context about Elizabeth first, because her situation was remarkably similar to Safiye's in some ways. Elizabeth had become Queen of England in 1558 after her sister Mary died. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the wife that Henry VIII had executed, so her claim to the throne was always somewhat shaky. Half of Europe thought she was illegitimate. The Catholic powers wanted her dead and replaced with a Catholic monarch, and she was a woman, an unmarried woman, ruling alone. This was almost unheard of in 16th century Europe. Everyone expected her to marry, to let a husband take over the real work of governing while she produced heirs. But Elizabeth never married. She kept potential suitors dangling for decades, using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool, but never actually going through with it. Why? Probably because she understood that marriage would mean giving up power. A husband would have authority over her. He could make decisions without her consent. He could drag England into wars for his own interests. Better to remain the Virgin Queen, answerable to no one, free to rule as she saw fit. Sound familiar? This is essentially what Safiye had been fighting for her whole life. Autonomy, authority, the ability to make decisions without having to defer to men. So when these two women started writing to each other, there was an immediate recognition. They understood each other in ways that the men around them could not. The first letters between them were formal, as diplomatic correspondence always is. They addressed each other with elaborate titles. Elizabeth called Safiye the most sacred sultan, the most gracious and most fortunate empress. Safiye called Elizabeth the Queen of England, the wisest among the queens of the Christian religion. These were not just pleasantries. In diplomatic language, the more titles you use, the more respect you are showing. But what were they actually negotiating? What did England and the Ottoman Empire want from each other? For England, the answer was trade. England was not yet the global power it would become in the next century. It was still a relatively minor player, trying to break into markets dominated by Spain, Portugal, and Venice. And the Ottoman Empire controlled the crossroads of the world, the trade routes between Europe and Asia, the Silk Roads, the spice routes. If England could establish good trading relations with the Ottomans, it would be a massive economic boost. For the Ottomans, the answer was alliance, or more specifically, they wanted England to help counterbalance Spain. You see, Spain at this time was the great Catholic superpower, and the Ottomans and the Spanish were engaged in an ongoing struggle for control of the Mediterranean. If England, Protestant England, which had its own reasons to hate Catholic Spain, could be brought into an anti-Spanish alliance that would be enormously useful. And there was another factor. Both women hated Spain. Elizabeth had nearly been invaded by the Spanish Armada in 1588. Safiye knew that Spain supported Venice and other enemies of the Ottoman Empire. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as they say. So Safiye and Elizabeth started building a relationship. They exchanged letters, they exchanged gifts, and these gifts are absolutely fascinating because they reveal so much about how these women saw each other and themselves. Elizabeth sent Safiye a coach. Now this was not just any coach. It was an elaborate, luxurious vehicle, upholstered in rich fabrics, decorated with gold leaf, pulled by multiple horses. It was the kind of thing that screamed wealth and power. And Elizabeth also sent an organ, a musical instrument that had never been seen in the Ottoman court before. Imagine the impression that made. The strange, exotic sounds filling the palace. The proof that England had access to knowledge and technology that the Ottomans did not. Safiye sent Elizabeth jewellery, gorgeous, elaborate pieces studded with gems. She sent fabrics, silk brocades in colours and patterns that English weavers could not replicate. She sent perfumes and exotic spices. She was showing off the wealth of the East, the sophistication of Ottoman craftsmanship. But they were also sending each other something else, recognition. By engaging in this correspondence, by treating each other as equals, they were validating each other's authority. Elizabeth was saying, I recognise that you, Safiye Sultan, are a power to be reckoned with. You're not just the Sultan's mother. You're a ruler in your own right. And Safiye was saying, I recognise that you, Elizabeth, are not just a queen waiting for a man to tell you what to do. You're a sovereign. In a world where both women constantly had to fight for their legitimacy, this mutual recognition was incredibly valuable. Now, the correspondence between Safiye and Elizabeth continued for several years, from about 1593 to 1599, and during that time, they discussed serious political matters. There are letters where they talk about trade agreements, about military cooperation against Spain, about the treatment of English merchants in Ottoman territories. One particularly interesting letter from Safiye discusses the possibility of releasing English prisoners who had been captured by Ottoman corsairs. She presents herself as intervening on behalf of these prisoners, using her influence with her son to secure their freedom. This is classic diplomatic soft power, showing mercy, building goodwill, creating the image of herself as a benevolent protector. But there is also something else going on in these letters. There is a sense of two women reaching across a vast cultural and religious divide to find common ground. Elizabeth writes to Safiye about their shared experiences as women in power. Safiye writes to Elizabeth about the challenges of governance. They are building a relationship that transcends the formal requirements of diplomacy, and the men around them did not really know what to make of it. The English ambassador to the Ottoman court, Edward Barton, mentions in his reports that Safiye is well affected towards our nation. The Grand Vizier expresses frustration that the Valide Sultan is conducting her own foreign policy. There is a sense that these women are operating in a space that the traditional power structures cannot quite control. But here is the fascinating part. It worked. The correspondence between Safiye and Elizabeth contributed to a warming of relations between England and the Ottoman Empire. Trade increased. An Anglo-Ottoman alliance against Spain was seriously discussed, though never fully implemented. English merchants gained better access to Ottoman markets. The relationship laid groundwork that would last for decades. And Safiye got something else out of it: prestige. By corresponding with one of the most famous queens in Europe, she was demonstrating that she was not just a figure of domestic politics. She was an international player, She was someone whom foreign rulers took seriously. Think about what this means. Safiye, who had started life as a captured slave girl from Albania, was now exchanging letters with the Queen of England. She was discussing international trade and military alliances. She was receiving exotic gifts from across Europe. She had risen so far that the traditional categories, slave, concubine, mother, no longer adequately described her. She was operating at the level of heads of state. But the relationship between Safiye and Elizabeth also highlights something bittersweet. Both of these women were extraordinarily powerful. Both of them shaped the course of their nations, but both of them were also limited by their gender in ways that their male counterparts were not. Elizabeth could never lead an army into battle, the way her father Henry VIII had. She could never travel freely without an enormous security apparatus. Her authority was constantly questioned, constantly challenged, in ways that a king's would not have been. Even though she ruled for 45 years and guided England through one of its most successful periods, people still whispered that a woman on the throne was unnatural. Safiye could never be sultan, no matter how capable she was. She could advise her son, she could influence policy, she could correspond with foreign queens. But the formal power rested with Mehmed III, even though everyone knew Safiye was the one actually running things. She had to operate through screens, through intermediaries, through the careful management of her public image. Both women were playing a game where the rules were stacked against them, and the fact that they succeeded anyway, that they built this relationship, that they wielded real power, that they are remembered today, is a testament to their extraordinary abilities. But let us talk about something that often gets overlooked in these grand diplomatic narratives: the emotional dimension. What did it mean for Safiye to receive letters from Elizabeth? What did it mean to have someone, anyone, recognize her as an equal? Because think about Safiye's life. She had spent years fighting for recognition, for power, for respect. She had been accused of witchcraft. She had been exiled. She'd clawed her way back to the pinnacle of Ottoman politics. But even there, at the top, she was surrounded by men who resented her influence, grand viziers who thought she was interfering, religious scholars who thought women should not be involved in governance, even her own son, who loved her but probably felt some ambivalence about being seen as controlled by his mother. And then she receives these letters from Elizabeth. Letters that treat her as a fellow ruler. Letters that acknowledge her power, her wisdom, her importance. That must have been incredibly validating. It must have reminded her that her struggle was not pointless, that she had achieved something real and lasting. And for Elizabeth, the relationship must have been equally meaningful. Elizabeth was isolated in many ways. She had no siblings still living. She never married, never had children. She was surrounded by the male advisors who were loyal, but who also had their own agendas. To have a correspondence with another powerful woman, even one from such a different world, must have been a rare source of understanding. There is a letter from Elizabeth to Safiye where she writes about the burdens of rule, about how heavy the crown can feel. It is a surprisingly personal moment in what is otherwise formal diplomatic correspondence, and you can sense, reading it, that Elizabeth is speaking to someone she thinks will understand in a way that the men around her never could. Unfortunately, the correspondence between Safiye and Elizabeth ended in the late 1590s. Elizabeth died in 1603, the same year as Mehmed III. Both women were in their 60s, old age for the era. Safiye lived another 16 years, but her power waned after Mehmed's death. She never again had the same influence, the same access to decision-making. But the fact that this relationship happened at all is remarkable. In an era when women were supposed to be confined to domestic spheres, two women reached across continents to build an alliance. They showed that diplomacy is not just about kings and generals. That soft power, the power of letters, gifts, relationships, can be just as effective as military might. And they showed that women in power recognize each other. They understand each other's struggles in ways that transcend culture and religion. The Ottoman Empire and Protestant England had almost nothing in common, but Safiye and Elizabeth found common ground in their shared experience of wielding power in a world that did not want them to have it. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think about connection. Think about how two women separated by thousands of miles and vast cultural differences found a way to communicate, to support each other, to build something together. Think about how power and friendship can sometimes exist in the same relationship. Think about how the world is shaped not just by grand battles and treaties, but by letters written late at night, by gifts carefully chosen, by two people deciding to treat each other with respect and dignity. Rest peacefully, my friends, because when we continue this journey, we are going to shift our focus to an even more dramatic story. We are going to meet Kösem Sultan, the woman who many historians consider the most powerful Ottoman woman who ever lived. Safiye was influential, but Kösem was regent 3 separate times. She ruled for nearly 30 years. She saw 6 sultans rise and fall, and her story will end in blood and betrayal in the middle of the night. It is a tale of maternal love and ruthless ambition, of charity and murder, of power taken to its absolute limit. Sleep well, for Kösem's story awaits. Every legend begins with a name, and the name Kösem tells you everything you need to know about the woman who would become the most powerful figure in Ottoman history. In Old Turkish, Kösem means the leader of the flock, the sheep who walks at the front, who decides where the herd will go, who sets the pace for everyone else. It is not a name you give to someone who follows. It is a name you give to someone who leads, and lead she did for 62 years. But before she was Kösem Sultan, before she was Valide Sultan, before she was regent to 3 different emperors, before she was the woman who would see 6 sultans rise and fall, she was just a girl. Probably from Bosnia, possibly from Greece. Her birth name was likely Anastasia, though some sources say it might have been something else. And honestly, the uncertainty does not matter, because whoever she was before she entered the palace, that girl disappeared completely. She was reborn as Mapika, moon-like femme, and then as Kösem, the leader. She arrived at Topkapı Palace around 1604 when she was probably 14 or 15 years old, and she was given as a gift to Sultan Ahmed I, who had just become Sultan the previous year at age 13. Yes, you heard that right. A 13-year-old sultan. The Ottoman Empire was being ruled by a child, which meant it was actually being ruled by his mother, Handan Sultan. But Handan died just a year later, in 1605, which left young Ahmed surrounded by ambitious viziers, scheming courtiers, and a harem full of women competing for his attention. He needed someone he could trust, someone who made him feel safe in a world that was suddenly terrifying and far too adult. He found that person in Mapika, in Kösem. The sources tell us that Ahmed fell deeply in love with her, not the consuming passion that Murad had for Safiye, not the strategic partnership that Selim had with Nurbanu. This was different. Ahmed was essentially still a child thrust into enormous responsibility. And Kösem, intelligent, calm, mature beyond her years, became his anchor, his confidant, his best friend. They married, actually married in a formal ceremony following the precedent that Hürrem had set decades earlier. And over the next 14 years, Kösem gave Ahmed 4 sons and 3 daughters, 4 potential sultans. She was securing her future with every birth, but more than that, she was learning. She was watching how the empire worked. She was understanding the relationships between the sultan, the grand vizier, the religious authorities, the military. She was figuring out where the real power lay and how to access it, and she was doing something else, something crucial. She was convincing Ahmed to end fratricide. Remember, for hundreds of years, every new sultan had executed his brothers to prevent civil war. It was brutal, but it was considered necessary. Except Ahmed had a problem. He only had one surviving brother, Mustafa, who was several years younger and possibly had some kind of mental disability. If Ahmed followed tradition and executed Mustafa, and then something happened to Ahmed's own sons, the Ottoman line would end, the dynasty would be finished. So Kösem convinced Ahmed to spare Mustafa, to keep him alive, locked away in the palace but breathing, and Ahmed, who loved and trusted Kösem, agreed. With that single decision, Kösem changed Ottoman history. She ended a practice that had lasted for centuries. She saved Mustafa's life, and she had no idea that this act of mercy would later come back to haunt her in the most terrible way imaginable. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay with the happy years for a moment. Because there were happy years. Ahmed and Kösem ruled together. Well, Ahmed ruled officially, but everyone knew Kösem had enormous influence. Ahmed even commissioned the famous Blue Mosque in Istanbul, which still stands today as one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. When you see photographs of Istanbul's skyline, that is Ahmed's legacy. Built during the years when he and Kösem were partners, and then in 1617 Ahmed died. He was only 27 years old. The cause was probably typhus, though some historians suspect poison. Regardless, he was gone, and Kösem, at 28 years old, was a widow with 7 children and absolutely no formal power. This is the moment when most women's stories would end. The Sultan is dead. The widow retires to the old palace. Life goes on without her. But Kösem's story was just beginning, because Ahmed's death created a succession crisis. His eldest son, Osman, was only 13. The next in line was Mustafa, the uncle whom Ahmed had spared, who was now in his 20s but mentally unstable. Who should rule, a child or a man who was not quite capable? The decision was made to put Mustafa on the throne, and Kösem supported this decision. Why? Because she understood something crucial. Osman was the son of Mahfiruz, a rival concubine. If Osman became Sultan, Mahfiruz would become Valide Sultan, not Kösem. But if Mustafa became Sultan, there was no valid Sultan. His mother was long dead, which meant the role would fall to the most senior woman in the palace, which was Kösem. It was a brilliant political calculation. Let Mustafa have the throne for a little while, wait for him to prove himself incapable. And then when he was deposed, which was inevitable, one of her own sons would take over, and she would become the real Valide Sultan. Except Mustafa lasted only 3 months. He was clearly not fit to rule, so he was deposed, and Osman II became Sultan after all. Osman ruled from 1618 to 1622, and during those 4 years Kösem was sidelined. She lived in the old palace away from power, watching her rival Mahfiruz enjoy the position that should have been hers. But Kösem was patient. She waited. She maintained her networks. She stayed in contact with her sons, who were being raised in the palace, and she watched as Osman made mistake after mistake. Osman was young and arrogant. He tried to break the power of the Janissaries, the elite military corps that had protected sultans for generations, but had also become a political force of their own. He threatened to disband them entirely and create a new army. The Janissaries were not happy about this, not happy at all. In 1622 the Janissaries rebelled. They stormed the palace. They deposed Osman, and they brought Mustafa back for a second reign. But here is the key detail. Who do you think the Janissaries consulted about all this? Who do you think they saw as the legitimate voice of the dynasty? Kösem, the mother of Ahmed's sons, the woman who had been sidelined but never defeated. When Mustafa was restored to the throne in 1622, he lasted only 16 months this time, and when he was deposed again in 1623, it was Kösem's 11-year-old son Murad IV who took the throne. Finally, after 6 years of waiting, of manoeuvring, of watching others hold power that should have been hers, Kösem became Valide Sultan. But she did not just become Valide Sultan, she became regent. Because Murad was only 11, he was a child, which meant someone had to actually run the empire, and that someone was Kösem. For the first time in 300 years of Ottoman history, a woman held the formal title of regent. Kösem Sultan, Naibi Saltanat, regent of the empire. She attended the divan meetings, the council where the empire's business was conducted. She sat behind a screen, as was proper for a woman, but everyone knew she was there. Everyone knew who was really making the decisions. Foreign ambassadors noted that if you wanted anything done in the Ottoman Empire, you needed Kösem's approval, not the Grand Viziers, not even the young sultans, Kösems, and the challenges she faced were enormous. The empire in the 1620s was not the empire of Suleiman's time. It was struggling. There were rebellions in the provinces, wars on multiple fronts, economic problems, corruption. The Janissaries were out of control, demanding bribes and threatening violence when they did not get what they wanted. Kösem had to manage all of this with a child sultan and a government full of men who resented taking orders from a woman. Some grand viziers worked with her, others tried to undermine her. In 1632, one particularly troublesome grand vizier was executed. Was Kösem behind it? Almost certainly. She was learning what Hürrem and Nurbanu and Safiye had all learned before her. Sometimes you have to be ruthless to survive. But here is what makes Kösem different from the women who came before her. She was not just ruthless. She was also genuinely charitable on a scale that was unprecedented. Kösem spent enormous sums of her own money, and the empire's money, on helping the poor. She established foundations to distribute money to people who claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. She paid the debts of people who were about to be imprisoned. She provided dowries for poor girls so they could get married. When there were fires or floods or other disasters, Kösem's agents would appear with money and supplies. And here is the part that I find most touching. She would sometimes disguise herself and walk through the streets of Istanbul, listening to people's problems, just an ordinary woman in ordinary clothes, hearing what people needed, learning what the government was doing wrong. And then she would return to the palace and fix those problems. The people loved her for this. They called her the protector of the poor. When she eventually died, the elegies written about her emphasized not her political power, but her compassion. Valide Shehide, the martyred mother. The people of Istanbul had never mourned anyone as deeply as they mourned Kösem, but we are jumping ahead again. During the 1620s and early 1630s, while Murad was growing up, Kösem ruled. She negotiated with foreign powers. She managed the military. She kept the rebellious Janissaries in check through a combination of bribes and threats. She was, in every meaningful sense, the Sultan. And then Murad grew up, and everything changed. Because Murad IV, as he matured, turned out to be nothing like his gentle father Ahmed. Murad was fierce, brutal, determined to restore the empire to its former glory through sheer force of will. He started leading military campaigns personally. He started executing people left and right. Anyone he suspected of disloyalty, corruption, or weakness. He reinstated the ban on alcohol and tobacco and would personally patrol the streets at night, executing anyone he caught drinking or smoking. He was effective. He reconquered Baghdad from the Persians. He restored order to the provinces. He made the empire fear him. But he was also terrifying. Even his own mother was afraid of him. And Kösem had another son to protect, Ibrahim. Ibrahim was younger, gentler, artistic, everything Murad was not. And Murad, in his paranoia, began to see Ibrahim as a threat. There were rumours that Murad planned to execute Ibrahim, to wipe out all possible rivals. Kösem had to walk a very careful line. She could not openly oppose Murad. He was the Sultan, and he had proven he would kill anyone who challenged him. But she could work behind the scenes to protect Ibrahim. She could remind Murad that Ibrahim was not a threat, that he had no ambition for the throne, that he just wanted to be left alone with his music and his gardens. And somehow, miraculously, Ibrahim survived. When Murad died in 1640, probably from cirrhosis of the liver, his body wrecked by years of heavy drinking despite his own prohibition on alcohol, Ibrahim became Sultan. Kösem's second son on the throne. She had done it again. She was Valide Sultan for the second time. But the circumstances were very different now. Murad had been a child when he took the throne. Ibrahim was 25, an adult. He had spent most of his life locked in a room, terrified that his brother would kill him. And now, suddenly, he was Sultan. He was not ready. He had never been prepared for this role. He had never expected to survive long enough to become Sultan, and he was not mentally stable. Years of fear and isolation had damaged him. For the next 8 years, from 1640 to 1648, Kösem once again ruled the empire. Ibrahim was Sultan in name, but everyone knew Kösem was making the actual decisions, and it was exhausting. She was in her 50s now. She had been dealing with palace politics for more than 4 decades. And Ibrahim was not an easy person to manage. He was unpredictable, sometimes violent, increasingly erratic. The situation could not last. And in 1648, a coalition of military leaders and religious authorities decided that Ibrahim had to go. He was deposed in a coup. And here is where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. Kösem agreed to Ibrahim's deposition, her own son. She agreed that he should be removed from the throne, but she was promised, absolutely promised, that his life would be spared. He would be confined to the palace, allowed to live out his days quietly, but he would not be executed. They lied to her. Within days of his deposition, Ibrahim was strangled. Her son, her gentle, damaged, tragic son. Did Kösem know this would happen? Did she suspect, or did she genuinely believe they would keep their promise? We cannot know, but the guilt must have been overwhelming. She had agreed to remove him from power, and he had died because of it. But there was no time to grieve, because Ibrahim's 7-year-old son, Kösem's grandson, was now Sultan Mehmed IV, and someone needed to be regent. For the 3rd time, Kösem stepped into that role. 3rd time, 60 years old, more than 4 decades in the palace, and she was still the one holding the empire together. But this time there was a problem, a big problem. A problem in the form of a young woman named Turhan Sultan, Mehmed's mother, the next Valide Sultan. And that conflict between grandmother and mother, between the old guard and the new generation, between 2 women who both believed they should rule, that conflict would end in blood. But that part of the story is still to come. For now, as you close your eyes, think about endurance. Think about Kösem, serving as regent 3 separate times across nearly 3 decades. Think about how she balanced ruthlessness and compassion, political calculation and genuine charity. Think about a woman who dressed in ordinary clothes to walk among her people, and who also ordered executions when necessary. Think about the complexity of power, the weight of decades, the cost of surviving when everyone around you falls. Rest peacefully, my friends, because when we continue we will witness the final terrible confrontation between Kösem and Turhan. We will see how the dynasty's greatest strength, a woman's determination to protect her children, becomes its greatest weakness. We will walk through the events of September 2nd, 1651, a night when the palace ran with blood and the most powerful woman in Ottoman history met her end. Sleep well, for the darkness is coming. The deadliest battles are not always fought on battlefields. Sometimes they happen in palaces, in the dark between people who should love each other. It is 1648. Sultan Mehmed IV is 7 years old. He sits on the throne of the Ottoman Empire, but he is a child. He needs guidance. He needs protection. He needs someone to rule in his name until he is old enough to rule himself. The question is, who? On one side stands Kösem Sultan. She is 60 years old. She has been Valide Sultan twice before. She has served as regent 3 times. She has seen 6 sultans rise and fall. She has more political experience than anyone else in the empire. She believes, she knows, that she is the right person to guide her grandson through the treacherous waters of imperial politics. On the other side stands a 25-year-old woman named Turhan Sultan. She is Mehmed's mother, which means, by tradition, she should be Valide Sultan. She should have the authority. She should have the power. 2 women, 1 child, 1 throne, and only one of them can hold the real power. This is the setup for one of the most dramatic power struggles in Ottoman history, and it ends with an assassination in the middle of the night. But before we get to that terrible ending, we need to understand how we arrived here. We need to understand Turhan. Turhan Sultan was born around 1623 in what is now Russia or Ukraine. She was captured when she was approximately 12 years old, just a child, and sent as a gift to the Ottoman court. Specifically, she was given to Kösem Sultan. Yes, you heard that right. Turhan was a gift to Kösem, who then gave her to her own son Ibrahim as a concubine. Think about that dynamic for a moment. Turhan entered Ibrahim's life because Kösem chose her. Kösem was the one who decided this young girl would be suitable for her son. In a sense, Turhan owed everything to Kösem. Her position, her opportunity, her entire future. But Turhan was not the type to feel grateful forever. She was smart, she was ambitious, and when she gave birth to Mehmed in 1642, she became a person of significance in her own right. No longer just another concubine. Now she was the mother of a potential sultan. And she watched. She watched as Ibrahim spiraled into instability. She watched as Kösem continued to hold real power even though Ibrahim was technically sultan. She watched as the empire lurched from crisis to crisis, and she learned. When Ibrahim was deposed and executed in 1648, Turhan found herself in an impossible position. He was the mother of the new sultan. By all rights, she should become Valide Sultan. But her son was only 7 years old. He could not rule alone. Someone needed to be regent. And Kösem made a decision that would seal her own fate. She decided that she, not Turhan, should be regent. She argued that Turhan was too young, too inexperienced, too naive to handle the complexities of ruling an empire. She pointed to her own decades of experience. She essentially said, "I have done this before, multiple times. Step aside and let someone who knows what they are doing take charge." Now, from a purely practical standpoint, Kösem was probably right. She did have more experience. She did understand the political landscape better. She probably could have done a better job managing the empire during Mehmed's minority. But from Turhan's perspective, this was an outrageous insult. This was Kösem yet again refusing to let go of power. This was a grandmother telling a mother that she could not be trusted to protect her own son's interests. This was a 60-year-old woman who had already had her turn, several turns, refusing to step aside for the next generation. Turhan felt disrespected, sidelined. humiliated, and she was not going to accept it. So the two women began to build their factions. And here is where the story becomes fascinating from a political science perspective, because we can actually see how power works in a system like this. It is not just about who has the title, it is about who has the support. Kösem had the janissaries. These were the elite military troops who had supported her for decades. They were loyal to her personally. They remembered how she had helped them, paid them bonuses, protected their interests. If it came to a fight, the janissaries would back Kösem. Turhan had the palace bureaucrats, the administrators, the eunuchs who ran the daily operations of the palace. These were men who were tired of Kösem's long reign, who wanted a change, who saw an opportunity for advancement if they backed Turhan. They were younger, hungrier, more willing to take risks. It was old power versus new power, military might versus administrative control, the established order versus the rising generation. And for 3 years, from 1648 to 1651, this Cold War played out in the corridors of Topkapi Palace. On the surface, Kösem was regent. She attended the divan meetings, she made the decisions, but behind the scenes, Turhan was building her network, winning allies, preparing for her moment. And then, in 1651, the tension exploded. There was an uprising in Istanbul that year. We do not know all the details, but it involved discontent among various military factions and possibly some provinces. The empire was unstable, and in that instability both women saw opportunity. Kösem apparently believed that this was her chance to remove Mehmed from the throne and replace him with another grandson, one who was older, one who would allow her to maintain power for longer. At least this is what Turhan's faction claimed. Whether Kösem was actually planning a coup, or whether this was just a rumour spread by her enemies, we cannot know for certain. But Turhan believed it, or claimed to believe it, and she decided to act first. It is the night of September 2nd, 1651. Most of the palace is asleep. The marble corridors are quiet except for the soft footsteps of guards making their rounds. In her chambers, Kösem Sultan, now 62 years old, is preparing for bed. She has survived so much, decades of palace intrigue, the deaths of husbands and sons, wars and rebellions and economic crises. She has outlasted rivals who seemed more powerful. She has rebuilt her influence again and again. She probably believes she will survive this challenge too. She is wrong. The accounts of what happened next vary depending on the source. Some say that a group of eunuchs, loyal to Turhan, entered Kösem's chambers. Some say they strangled her with a curtain. Others say they beat her to death. Still others claim she tried to hide but was discovered and killed. The details are murky and violent and deeply disturbing. But the outcome is clear. Kösem Sultan, the most powerful woman in Ottoman history, died that night, murdered by people working for her own daughter-in-law, killed in the same palace where she had lived for nearly 50 years. Her body was found in the morning, and the reaction from the people of Istanbul was extraordinary. They poured into the streets to mourn, they wept openly. They wrote elegies calling her Valide Sultan, the martyred mother. They remembered not her political machinations, not her ruthlessness, but her charity, the dowries she had provided, the debts she had paid, the disasters she'd relieved. The people loved Kösem in a way they'd never loved Hürrem or Nurbanu or Safiye, because Kösem had walked among them, she had listened to them, she had genuinely tried to help them, even while playing the brutal game of palace politics. And now she was gone, killed in a power struggle with her own family. But here is the question that haunts this story. Was Kösem really planning to depose Mehmed? Or was that just an excuse, a justification that Turhan needed to make the murder seem necessary rather than merely convenient? We will never know the truth. What we do know is that Turhan immediately took power after Kösem's death. She became Valide Sultan and regent, and one of her first acts was to declare that no woman should ever again hold as much power as Kösem had held. The Janissaries, Kösem's old allies, were purged of leaders loyal to her memory. The system was restructured to ensure that future Valide sultans would have influence but not dominance. Turhan was essentially saying Kösem was an aberration, an exception. It should never happen again, and in a way she was right. After Kösem's death, no Ottoman woman ever achieved quite the same level of power. Turhan herself was regent from 1651 to 1656, and she was capable and effective. She spent enormous sums on strengthening the empire's defences. She completed the construction of the Yeni Mosque, which Safiye had started decades earlier. She was a legitimate power in her own right, but she never had the mystique that Kösem had. She never commanded the same loyalty. She never became a legend in quite the same way. And perhaps that was by design. Perhaps Turhan understood that Kösem's kind of power, absolute, unquestioned, maintained across decades, was too dangerous, too threatening to the men who actually wanted to run the empire. Better to be powerful but not too powerful. Better to be influential but not dominant. Or perhaps Turhan simply could not achieve what Kösem had achieved because the circumstances were different. Kösem had come to power during a period of weak sultans, child rulers, mentally unstable rulers, rulers who needed her. Turhan's son Mehmed IV would eventually grow into a competent adult sultan who did not need or want his mother making decisions for him. But let us step back and think about what this conflict really represents. Because on one level, this is a story about two specific women fighting for power. But on another level, this is a story about how patriarchal systems manage female power. The Ottoman system allowed women to wield enormous influence. It created institutional roles, Kösem Sultan, Valide Sultan, that gave women real authority. But it also ensured that this authority was always temporary, always mediated through men, always dependent on their relationship to a sultan. Kösem was powerful because she was the mother of sultans, but that power was only legitimate as long as people accepted her role as mother and protector. The moment people started to see her as pursuing her own agenda, rather than her son's or grandson's interests, her power became threatening. It became something that needed to be stopped. And the way it was stopped tells us something important. Even the most powerful woman in the empire could be killed by a small group of determined men in the middle of the night. All her decades of experience, all her networks, all her loyal supporters, none of it could protect her when her enemies decided to act. This is the fundamental vulnerability of power that depends on other people's tolerance rather than your own institutional authority. As long as people chose to respect Kösem's influence, she had power. The moment they chose not to, she had nothing. Contrast this with a male sultan. A sultan could be deposed, certainly. It happened multiple times in Ottoman history, but it usually required a massive conspiracy, often involving the military. It was a big, risky operation, whereas killing Kösem apparently required just a handful of eunuchs loyal to Turhan. The operation was small, quick, and successful. That difference tells you everything about the nature of female power in this system. It was real, it was significant, but it was also precarious in ways that male power was not. And yet, for all that precarity, for all that vulnerability, Kösem ruled for nearly 3 decades. She shaped the course of the empire. She saved lives, built institutions, made decisions that affected millions of people. Her power may have been dependent and temporary, but it was power nonetheless. And the fact that it ended in murder does not diminish what she achieved. If anything, it emphasizes it. Because people do not murder the powerless. They do not conspire against the irrelevant. Turhan killed Kösem precisely because Kösem was too powerful, too entrenched, too impossible to dislodge by any other means. The murder was an admission of Kösem's strength, not her weakness. It was Turhan saying, "I cannot beat you politically. I cannot outmaneuver you. The only way I can remove you is to kill you." And so she did, in the dark, in the palace, while most of the city slept. The Sultanate of Women did not end with Kösem's death. Turhan continued as Valide Sultan for years. Other women would hold the title after her, but something did end that night in 1651, the era of women holding supreme power, of women serving as regent for decades, of women being the actual rulers rather than just influential mothers. That era was over. The men of the empire decided that Kösem was the limit. No more, never again, and they made that decision not through law or decree, but through murder in the night. Because that is how power really works. Not through formal rules, but through violence and the threat of violence. And women, no matter how powerful, are always vulnerable to that ultimate form of power. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think about endings. Think about how even the strongest among us are mortal, vulnerable, finite. Think about Kösem, who survived so much and achieved so much, meeting her end not on a battlefield or in a grand political confrontation, but in her bedroom, at the hands of hired killers. Think about the injustice of it, the tragedy of it, and also the terrible logic of it. Power makes you a target. The higher you rise, the harder others will work to bring you down, and eventually everyone falls. Rest peacefully, my friends, because when we continue, we will meet the woman who stepped over Kösem's body to claim her place. Turhan Sultan, the young woman from Russia who became the last truly powerful Valide Sultan. We will see how she ruled, what she built, how she tried to ensure that what happened to Kösem would never happen again. And we will explore what it meant to be the woman who ended an era, who closed the door on the Sultanate of Women, and who lived with that legacy for the rest of her life. Sleep well, for Turhan's story awaits in the gentle darkness. How do you live with yourself after you have ordered the death of the most beloved woman in the empire? That is the question Turhan Sultan woke up to every morning for the rest of her life. She had won. She had claimed the power that should have been hers. She was Valide Sultan and regent, but the victory came soaked in the blood of a woman who had once been her benefactor, a woman the people adored, a woman whose memory would not fade. Turhan was 28 years old when Kösem died. She had spent 16 years in the palace. She had survived the chaos of Ibrahim's unstable reign. She had protected her son through a dangerous deposition and succession. And now she held the reins of the Ottoman Empire. But she held them very differently than Kösem had. Because Turhan understood something crucial. She could not be Kösem. She could not rule for decades. She could not become the kind of figure who overshadowed sultans for generations. The very fact that Kösem had been murdered proved that the empire, or at least the powerful men who really ran it, would not tolerate another woman with that much power. So Turhan made a strategic decision. She would be powerful, yes, but she would also be careful. She would work within the system rather than trying to dominate it. She would build alliances rather than creating dependence. She would be a regent, but she would prepare for the day when her son would no longer need her. It was a completely different approach to power than any of the women who came before her. Hürrem had seized power through passion and marriage. Nurbanu had wielded it through diplomatic networks. Safiye had survived through patience and mystique. Kösem had claimed it through sheer force of will and decades of experience. Turhan was going to build things, permanent things, things that would outlast her reign and establish her legacy in a way that could not be murdered in the night. Her first priority was securing her position, and that meant dealing with the Janissaries, who had been loyal to Kösem. These were the same elite troops who had made and unmade sultans for generations. They were angry about Kösem's death. They were dangerous. Turhan did not try to crush them. That would have started a civil war. Instead, she paid them enormous bonuses, gifts, promises of future rewards. She essentially bought their loyalty, or at least their neutrality. It was not elegant, but it was effective. The Janissaries grumbled, but they accepted the new order. Next, she restructured the palace administration. She promoted men who were loyal to her, who owed their positions to her support. But she was also careful to maintain some continuity, to not alienate the old guard completely. She was threading a very delicate needle, consolidating power without appearing to grab too much of it. And then she turned her attention to something that would define her legacy: the Yeni Mosque. The new mosque, Yeni Cami in Turkish, sits right in the heart of Istanbul in the Eminönü district by the water. It is one of the most prominent buildings in the entire city. You cannot miss it. The dome and the minarets, the elegant proportions, it is absolutely gorgeous. But here is the thing. Turhan did not start this project. Safiye Sultan had started it decades earlier, back in the 1590s. Safiye had commissioned the mosque, had hired the architects, had begun construction. But then she fell from power when her son Mehmed III died in 1603. The project stalled. For nearly 50 years, this half-finished mosque sat in the middle of Istanbul, a monument to interrupted ambition. Turhan decided to complete it. And this decision tells you everything about her political intelligence. First, by completing a mosque started by Safiye, Turhan was positioning herself as the inheritor of the Sultanate of Women tradition. She was saying, I am part of this lineage. I belong here. This was important because she was still relatively young, still somewhat of an outsider compared to Kösem's decades of established power. Second, completing the mosque was a massive public works project. It employed thousands of workers. It pumped money into the economy. It demonstrated that Turhan cared about Istanbul, about beautifying the city, about creating something for the people. This was especially important after Kösem's death, because Turhan needed to win public opinion. She needed people to see her as a legitimate leader, not just as Kösem's murderer. Third, and this is the really clever part, by building a mosque, Turhan was establishing her piety. She was showing that she was a good Muslim, that she was using her power for religious purposes, that she had divine sanction. In a world where women's authority was always questioned, having the backing of religious legitimacy was invaluable. The Yeni Mosque was completed in 1665. It took Turhan 14 years and an absolutely enormous amount of money. But when it was finished, it was spectacular. And it still stands today, more than 350 years later, as Turhan's primary legacy. When you visit Istanbul now, when you walk through Eminönü, when you see that magnificent building, with its courtyard and fountains and the pigeons everywhere, you are seeing Turhan's vision, not Safiye's. Turhan took someone else's unfinished dream and made it her own. But Turhan did more than just build mosques. She also invested heavily in the empire's military infrastructure. Remember, this was the mid-17th century. The Ottoman Empire was facing serious challenges. There were wars with Venice over control of Crete. There were threats from Persia in the east. There were rebellions in various provinces. The empire needed strong defences. Turhan spent enormous sums fortifying key military strongholds. She funded the reconstruction of fortresses. She ensured that the army was properly supplied. She understood that the empire's survival depended on military strength, and she made it a priority. And when her son Mehmed IV returned from a successful military campaign in 1656, Turhan did something brilliant. She organised a massive royal procession through Istanbul, retracing his warpath, allowing the people to celebrate his victory. It was political theatre at its finest. It emphasized Mehmed's role as a warrior sultan, following in the tradition of his ancestors, and it also reminded everyone that Turhan was the mother of this victorious sultan. It elevated them both. But here is the most interesting thing about Turhan's regency. It was relatively short. She served as formal regent from 1651 to 1656, only 5 years. After that, Mehmed IV began to rule more independently. He was 14, old enough to participate in government, and Turhan stepped back. Not completely, of course. She remained Valide Sultan. She still had influence. She still advised her son, but she was no longer regent. She was no longer the sole power behind the throne. Compare this to Kösem, who served as regent across nearly 3 decades, who continued to dominate even when her sons were adults, who never really let go of power. Turhan let go, or at least she appeared to let go, and this is why she survived when Kösem did not, because the powerful men of the empire, the grand viziers, the military commanders, the religious authorities, they could tolerate a woman having influence. They could even tolerate a woman serving as regent for a few years during a child sultan's minority. That was precedented, that was acceptable. But what they could not tolerate was a woman who refused to step aside, a woman who acted like the sultan herself, a woman who made it clear that she, not the men around her, was the real power in the empire. Kösem had crossed that line. Turhan was careful not to, and that is why Turhan died peacefully in her bed in 1683, at the age of 60, after more than 30 years as Valide Sultan, while Kösem was strangled in the dark. Now, I want to be clear. I am not saying Turhan was weak or powerless after 1656. She was still one of the most influential people in the empire. She still made decisions, she still shaped policy. But she did it more subtly. She worked through other people. She let her son take the credit. She operated within the acceptable boundaries of female power rather than constantly pushing against them. Is this admirable? Is this strategic brilliance? Or is it a sad compromise, a talented woman limiting herself because the alternative was death? Honestly, it is probably both. Turhan made the choices she needed to make to survive and thrive in the system she found herself in. And she achieved enormous things within those constraints. The Yeni Mosque alone would be a significant legacy. But she also strengthened the empire's defences, maintained stability during a turbulent period, and raised a son who would rule for 39 years, one of the longest reigns in Ottoman history. But she also marked the end of an era. After Turhan, there would be other Valide sultans, but none of them would have the kind of power that Hürrem, Nurbanu, Safiye or Kösem had wielded. None of them would serve as formal regents for years. None of them would dominate the empire the way those earlier women had. In 1683, when Turhan died, the Sultanate of Women, that extraordinary period when women shaped the Ottoman Empire, officially ended. It had lasted for about 150 years, from Hürrem's marriage to Suleiman in 1534 to Turhan's death in 1683. And Turhan knew she was the last. She must have known. She had seen what happened to women who tried to hold too much power for too long. She had been the one who made it happen to Kösem. So she chose a different path, a more sustainable path, a safer path. But here is the question that I find myself asking. Did Turhan make the right choice? Or did she betray the legacy of the women who came before her? Because those earlier women, Hürrem, Nurbanu, Safiye, Kösem, they pushed boundaries, they demanded power, they refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on them. Yes, Kösem paid for it with her life, but she also ruled for 3 decades. She shaped history. She made a difference on a scale that Turhan, for all her intelligence and success, never quite matched. Turhan was cautious where Kösem was bold. She was diplomatic where Hürrem was passionate. She was careful where Safiye was daring. And because of that caution, she survived. But did she change the system? Did she make it easier for women who came after her? Or did she actually make it harder by accepting limits that her predecessors had fought against? I do not think there is a simple answer to this question. Turhan did what she needed to do in her specific circumstances. She saw what happened to Kösem and decided that she would not make the same mistakes. That is not cowardice. That is survival. But it is also true that after Turhan, women in the Ottoman system had less power, not more. The precedent she set was one of limitation rather than expansion. She drew a line and said, "This far and no further." And that line held for the rest of Ottoman history. So Turhan's legacy is complicated. She was the last of the great Valide Sultans. She completed one of Istanbul's most beautiful mosques. She strengthened the empire during a critical period. She survived and thrived in a deadly political environment. But she was also the woman who killed Kösem, the woman who ended an era, the woman who proved that even the most powerful woman in the empire could be eliminated if she threatened the status quo too much. And then she carefully ensured that no woman would ever threaten the status quo that much again. Is that pragmatism or betrayal? Wisdom or cowardice? The answer probably depends on your perspective, on whether you value survival or revolution, on whether you think slow, incremental progress is better than bold, risky transformation. Turhan chose survival. She chose the long game. She chose to build monuments that would last rather than wielding power that might be taken away in the night. And she lived to see her son become a successful sultan. She lived to see her mosque completed. She lived to die peacefully in her bed. Kösem chose power. She chose to dominate. She chose to rule even when it made her enemies, and she died violently, killed by those enemies. But she also changed the empire in ways that Turhan never did. She showed what was possible. She proved that a woman could rule an empire, not just influence it from the shadows. Both of them were extraordinary women. Both of them shaped history. But they represent two different philosophies of power, two different strategies for navigating a world designed to limit women. And as you drift towards sleep tonight, you can decide for yourself which path you respect more. The bold revolutionary who burns bright and dies young, or the careful strategist who builds slowly and dies old? There is no right answer. History needs both kinds of people. Rest peacefully, my friends, because when we continue, we're going to step back and look at the bigger picture. We're going to explore the physical spaces where all these dramas unfolded, the architecture of power, the mosques and palaces and charitable complexes that these women built. Because while political power is temporary, architecture is forever. While personal authority can be murdered in the night, buildings stand for centuries. These women understood that, and the skyline of Istanbul today is testament to their vision. Sleep well, for there is beauty waiting in the stones and tiles and soaring domes of their legacy. Stone and tile speak louder than any declaration of power ever could. Walk through Istanbul today, and everywhere you turn you will see them. The mosques, the public kitchens, the schools, the hospitals, the fountains where travellers can drink fresh water, the baths where people can cleanse themselves. All of these buildings, many of them still functioning after 400 years, were built by the women we have been talking about. Women who understood something profound. Political power fades, but architecture endures. Think about it. The men who were sultans during this period built their monuments too. Grand mosques, elaborate palaces, military fortifications. And those buildings are impressive. The Süleymaniye Mosque, built by Suleiman the Magnificent, is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. But here is the interesting thing. Almost every sultan built at least one major mosque. It was expected. It was part of the job description. But for women to build on this scale, that was revolutionary. That was unprecedented. That was these women saying, we may not be able to sit on the throne, but we can shape this city just as profoundly as any sultan. Let us start with what they built and why it mattered. Hürrem Sultan's complex in Istanbul is staggering in its scope. It was not just a mosque, though the mosque is gorgeous. It was an entire social welfare system built in stone. There was a hospital that provided free medical care to the poor. There was a soup kitchen that fed hundreds of people every day. There was a school that educated children who otherwise would have had no access to learning. There were public baths where people could maintain their hygiene and their health. And here is the crucial part. All of this was funded by a waqf, a charitable foundation. Hürrem set aside property and income-generating assets, and the revenue from those assets funded the complex in perpetuity. It was not charity that depended on her personal generosity. It was a self-sustaining institution that would continue to serve the community long after she was dead. Think about the intelligence required to set that up. You need to understand property law, economics, administration, long-term planning. You need to hire architects and engineers and builders. You need to negotiate with religious authorities to get the proper approvals. You need to manage enormous sums of money without it all disappearing into corruption. Hürrem did all of this. A woman who had started life as a captured slave, who had no formal education in any of these areas, built one of the most sophisticated charitable institutions in the empire. And she built it in her own name. The complex was called the Haseki Sultan Complex. Her name, her legacy, not her husband's, not her son's, hers. This was a woman claiming ownership of public space in a way that women were not supposed to do. And she got away with it because she framed it as piety and charity. Who could object to building a hospital? Who could criticize feeding the poor? The genius was using religious and charitable motivations to do something that was actually deeply political, establishing herself as a permanent presence in Istanbul's landscape. Now let us talk about Mihrimah's two mosques, because they reveal a different strategy. Remember, Mihrimah was born into royalty. She did not need to prove her legitimacy the way Hürrem did, but she did need to establish her own identity separate from her famous mother and father. The Mihrimah Sultan Mosque in Üsküdar, completed in 1548, is intimate and elegant. It sits right by the water, and the way the light comes through the windows is absolutely breathtaking. When you sit in that mosque, you feel peaceful, contemplative, connected to something larger than yourself. The Mihrimah Sultan Mosque at Edirnekepe, completed in 1565, is completely different. It sits on top of one of Istanbul's 7 hills commanding the skyline. It is grander, more imposing. When you stand in that mosque, you feel elevated, powerful, part of something magnificent. 2 mosques, 2 different emotional experiences, and both of them designed by Mimar Sinan, quite possibly the greatest architect in Islamic history. Sinan worked for the sultans, yes, but he also worked for Mihrimah, and the care he put into her buildings, the innovation, the artistry, it suggests that he saw her as a legitimate patron worthy of his best work. And then there is that legend about the sun and the moon. On the spring equinox, the sun sets behind the mosque at Edirnekepe just as the moon rises behind the mosque at Üsküdar. Sun and moon. Mihrimah. Whether Sinan planned this or whether it is just a beautiful coincidence, it has become part of Istanbul's mythology. Mihrimah's story is literally written in the alignment of the stars. That is legacy. That is the kind of immortality that political power alone can never achieve. Nurbanu Sultan's Attic Valide Mosque complex in Üsküdar is the largest kuliye. That is a complex of buildings around a mosque, ever built by a woman in Ottoman history. It was completed in 1583, the year of her death, and it includes a mosque, a madrasa for religious education, a hospital, a public kitchen, a caravanserai for travellers, and a bathhouse. But what I find most interesting about this complex is its location. Nurbanu could have built in the centre of Istanbul where everyone would see it, where it would be maximally visible. But she chose Üsküdar, on the Asian side of the Bosphorus. Why? Because Üsküdar was where travellers entered Istanbul from the east. It was where merchants came from the Silk Roads. It was where pilgrims passed on their way to Mecca. By building there, Nurbanu was positioning herself at a crossroads. She was saying, everyone who comes to this city will see my monument. Everyone will know my name. And it worked. For centuries, that complex served as a landmark, resting place, a source of aid for travellers. Nurbanu's name became associated with hospitality, with welcoming strangers, with caring for people far from home. That is a very specific kind of power, soft power, cultural power, the power to shape how people remember you. Safiye Sultan started the Yeni Mosque, but Turhan completed it. And the story of this building tells us something important about how these women saw themselves in relation to each other. Turhan could have started her own project. She had the resources. She had the authority. She could have built something completely new, something that was entirely hers. But instead, she chose to complete Safiye's unfinished mosque. Why? I think it was a deliberate attempt to position herself within the tradition of powerful women. Turhan was relatively young when she became Valide Sultan. She had enemies who questioned her legitimacy. By completing Safiye's mosque, she was saying, I am continuing the work of the women who came before me. I am part of this lineage. I belong here. But she also made it hers. The mosque is called Yeni Cami, the new mosque, but it is also known as the Valide Sultan Mosque. And when you visit it, when you see the gorgeous Iznik tiles, the elegant calligraphy, the soaring dome, you're seeing Turhan's vision as much as Safiye's. She took an unfinished project and made it into something magnificent. That is a metaphor for her entire political strategy. Now, all of these buildings are beautiful. They are artistically significant. They are important pieces of Islamic architecture. But I want you to understand that they were also deeply political acts. When a woman builds a mosque, she is doing several things at once. First, she is demonstrating her piety. She is showing that she is a good Muslim, that she deserves divine favour, that her power has religious legitimacy. This is crucial in a society where women's authority is always questioned. Second, she is creating jobs. These building projects employed thousands of people: architects, engineers, stonemasons, carpenters, tile makers, calligraphers, labourers. They pumped money into the economy. They created goodwill among the working classes. They made the woman who commissioned them popular with ordinary people. Third, she is establishing a permanent presence in the physical landscape of the city. Unlike political power, which can be taken away, a building stands. It occupies space. It cannot be ignored or forgotten. Every time someone prays in that mosque, every time someone gets medical care in that hospital, every time someone eats in that soup kitchen, they are experiencing the legacy of the woman who built it. Fourth, and this is subtle but important, she is demonstrating her capability. Building on this scale requires enormous administrative skill. You have to manage budgets, coordinate workers, navigate bureaucracy, deal with setbacks and delays. If you can successfully complete a major construction project, you are proving that you can run a complex organization. You are showing that you are competent, capable, worthy of authority. So when we look at these buildings, we should not just see beautiful architecture. We should see political manifestos built in stone. We should see women claiming space in a world that tried to confine them. We should see strategies of power that were brilliant precisely because they appeared to be about piety and charity rather than politics. And it worked. These buildings are still standing. 400 years later, people still use them, still pray in them, still benefit from them. The women who built them are remembered and honoured. Their names are part of Istanbul's identity. Compare this to the political victories these women achieved. Who remembers the specific grand viziers they appointed? Who can name the treaties they negotiated? Political history fades. Buildings endure. But there is something else these buildings tell us. They tell us about how these women saw their role in society, because look at what they built. Not palaces for themselves, not monuments to their own glory. They built hospitals, schools, soup kitchens, public baths, infrastructure that served the community. This was not just strategic. I think it was also sincere. These women understood what it meant to be powerless. They'd all started as slaves or captives. They knew what it was like to be hungry, frightened, dependent on the mercy of others. And when they gained power, they used it to help people who were still in that position. Kösem, we know, would disguise herself and walk among the poor, listening to their problems, providing aid. That compassion was real, and it expressed itself in her building projects. The Çinili Mosque, covered in beautiful Iznik tiles, sits in Üsküdar and includes a public fountain where anyone can drink. It is not just beautiful, it is functional. It serves a need. This is a very different model of power than we often see. These women were not just accumulating authority for its own sake. They were using that authority to build things, to create institutions, to improve lives. Yes, it was also political. Yes, it served their interests. But it also genuinely helped people. And I think that is why the people of Istanbul loved them. Particularly Kösem. The people mourned her death not because she was politically powerful, but because she had fed them when they were hungry. She had paid their debts when they were desperate. She had built places where they could worship, learn, heal. The buildings were proof that her power was not just about herself. It was about the community, and that made it legitimate in a way that naked political ambition could never be. So when you think about the Sultanate of Women, do not just think about palace intrigue and power struggles. Think also about the Istanbul skyline. Think about the mosques that still call the faithful to prayer. Think about the fountains that still provide fresh water. Think about the institutions that still serve the community after 4 centuries. Because that is the real legacy. Not who married which sultan. Not who served as regent for how many years. The real legacy is built in stone and tile, soaring toward the sky, permanent and beautiful and useful. These women understood that immortality is not about being remembered. It is about being present. And their buildings make them present in Istanbul every single day. You cannot walk through that city without encountering their vision, their generosity, their ambition carved into the very fabric of the urban landscape. They changed the city. They shaped it. They made it what it is. And every person who has ever prayed in those mosques, been treated in those hospitals, eaten in those soup kitchens, studied in those schools, every single one of them has been touched by these women's power, whether they know it or not. That is legacy. That is what it means to build something that lasts. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine those buildings. Imagine the light filtering through stained glass windows. Imagine the sound of fountains in marble courtyards. Imagine the smell of bread being distributed to the hungry. Imagine centuries of people finding shelter, finding healing, finding peace in spaces created by women who started with nothing and built something eternal. Rest peacefully, my friends, because when we continue, we are going to bring all of these threads together. We are going to step back and ask, what can we learn from these women? What do their stories teach us about power, about ambition, about surviving in systems designed to limit us? What strange lessons does this history hold for us today, in our own struggles, in our own lives? Sleep well, for wisdom waits in the darkness, ready to emerge with the dawn. What strikes me most about these women, after spending all this time with their stories, is how completely they defy our expectations. We were taught that the Ottoman Empire was oppressive to women, that harems were prisons, that Islam confined women to domestic roles with no power, no voice, no agency. And yet here we have 150 years where enslaved women rose to rule one of the most powerful empires on earth, where a girl captured in a raid could become more influential than most European queens, where women shaped foreign policy, commanded armies indirectly, built institutions that still serve communities today. How do we make sense of this contradiction? How do we reconcile what we thought we knew with what actually happened? I think the answer is that history is always more complicated than our simple narratives allow, and these women's stories teach us lessons that are still relevant today, in our own struggles, in our own lives. So let us talk about those lessons. Let us pull out the strange wisdom hidden in these tales of power and survival. Lesson 1. Education is the most powerful weapon you can possess. Every single one of these women was educated, not just taught to read and write, but genuinely educated in multiple languages, in music and poetry, in mathematics, in religious texts, in the arts of conversation and diplomacy. The harem was not just a residence, it was a school, and the women who succeeded were the ones who took that education seriously. Hürrem could discuss politics and poetry with equal skill. Nurbanu understood economics well enough to manage vast charitable foundations. Safiye learned multiple languages and used them to conduct her own foreign correspondence. Kösem grasped the complexities of military logistics and provincial administration. These were not decorative accomplishments. These were practical skills that allowed them to operate at the highest levels of power. And think about what this means. These women started with nothing, absolutely nothing. They were captured, enslaved, stripped of their identities. The only thing they could build on was their minds, their intelligence, their ability to learn and adapt and understand complex systems. That is a lesson we can use today. In a world that constantly changes, where old certainties dissolve, where systems shift beneath our feet, the ability to learn, to really learn, deeply and continuously, is the foundation of all other power. These women understood that 500 years ago. Lesson 2. Networks matter more than individual brilliance. None of these women succeeded alone. They all built networks of supporters, allies, confidants. Hürrem allied with her daughter Mihrimah and son-in-law Rustam Pasha. Nurbanu worked with the Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha and relied on her Kira Esther Handali. Safiye maintained relationships across decades, staying connected even during her years of exile. Kösem cultivated the Janissaries and various court factions. These networks were not just political coalitions, they were also emotional support systems. Being a powerful woman in a patriarchal society is isolating. You are always the exception, always the outsider, always having to prove yourself in ways that men never do. Having other people who understand your position, who support your goals, who will act on your behalf when you cannot act directly, that is invaluable. And notice who these women included in their networks. Not just other powerful people, but also servants, eunuchs, merchants, scribes, religious scholars. They understood that power exists at all levels of society, and you need allies everywhere. The Jewish Kiras who served as agents were often the key to these women's success, precisely because they could move between worlds in ways that the women themselves could not. This is still true today. Your network, the people who support you, who amplify your voice, who open doors for you, is often more important than your individual talents. And building that network requires genuine relationships, not just transactional exchanges. It requires seeing value in people who might not seem immediately powerful, because today's servant might be tomorrow's decision maker. Lesson 3. Patience and timing are forms of power. Safiye spent 3 years in exile, 3 years away from power, away from Murad, away from everything she had worked for, and she waited. She did not break, she did not give up. She prepared for her return, and when it came she was ready. Kösem spent 6 years in the old palace after Ahmed's death, watching others hold the power that should have been hers. And she waited. She maintained her networks. She stayed connected to her sons. And when her moment came, she seized it. Turhan waited too. She endured years of being overshadowed by Kösem, of having her authority questioned, of watching her mother-in-law make decisions that should have been hers to make. And when she finally acted, it was decisive and effective. In our culture, we often valorize immediate action. We want results now. We want success quickly. But these women understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait. Wait for your opponent to make a mistake, and wait for circumstances to change. Wait for the right moment to act. This is not passivity. This is strategy. It takes enormous strength to wait when you want to act, to stay silent when you want to scream, to appear weak when you're actually just biding your time. But that patience, combined with careful preparation, can be devastating. Lesson 4. Compassion and ruthlessness are not opposites. This is perhaps the most challenging lesson. We want our heroes to be purely good. We want to believe that kind people do not do cruel things, that compassionate people are never ruthless. But Kösem fed the poor and also ordered executions. She walked the streets in disguise to hear people's problems and also probably arranged the murder of her stepson Mustafa. She built hospitals and schools and also engaged in brutal palace politics that left bodies in its wake. Were these contradictions, or were they different facets of the same complex person? I think these women understood something that we often do not want to acknowledge. Kindness to some people requires cruelty to others. Protecting your children might mean eliminating your enemies. Building institutions to serve the poor might require seizing wealth from the rich. Maintaining stability might require violence against those who threaten it. This does not make the cruelty good, but it also does not erase the genuine compassion. Human beings are complicated. We can hold multiple truths at once. We can be nurturing and destructive, generous and calculating, loving and ruthless. These women did not have the luxury of moral purity. They operated in a system where showing weakness meant death. So they learned to be hard when necessary, but they also chose to be kind when they could. They balanced the two as best they could manage, and maybe that is what real morality looks like in the actual world. Not pure goodness, which is often just another form of privilege, but the difficult work of making ethical choices in situations with no perfect options. Lesson 5. Systems are stronger than individuals. This is the sad lesson, the lesson that frustrates me even as I recognize its truth. These women were extraordinary. They were intelligent, determined, strategic, capable. They achieved things that seemed impossible. They bent a patriarchal system to their will for 150 years. and then the system reasserted itself. After Kösem's murder, after Turhan's careful regency, the door closed. No more women ruling as regents for decades. No more Valide Sultans dominating the political landscape. The Sultanate of Women ended not because women stopped being capable, but because the men in power decided it had gone too far. Individual brilliance can push against a system's limits. It can create exceptions, carve out space, accomplish extraordinary things. But ultimately, systems are designed to perpetuate themselves. They absorb challenges, they adapt, they find new equilibriums that preserve the fundamental power structures. This is depressing, but it is also important to understand because it means that individual achievement, while inspiring and valuable, is not enough. If you want lasting change, you have to change the system itself. You have to create new institutions, new laws, new cultural norms that make equality the default rather than the exception. The Ottoman women did not do this. They worked within the system. They found ways to gain power without challenging the fundamental premise that men should rule and women should support. And because they never challenged that premise, their extraordinary achievements ended when the system decided to close the loophole they had exploited. What would have happened if they had tried to change the system itself? We cannot know. Maybe they would have been crushed immediately. Maybe there was no realistic path to systemic change in 16th and 17th century Ottoman society. But we can learn from their example that exceptions, no matter how glorious, are not the same as equality. Lesson 6. Legacy is a choice. These women could have used their power purely for personal gain. They could have hoarded wealth, lived in luxury and left nothing behind but memories of their own glory. Some powerful people throughout history have done exactly that. But these women chose differently. They built things. Mosques and hospitals and schools and soup kitchens. They established charitable foundations that would continue serving people for centuries after their deaths. They invested in institutions rather than just enjoying the fruits of power. Why? Partly because it was politically smart. Building for the public generated goodwill and legitimacy, but I also think it reflected a genuine understanding that power is meaningless if it does not create something lasting. What is the point of being the most powerful woman in the empire if, the moment you die, it is as though you never existed? But if you build a hospital that heals people for 400 years, if you build a school that educates generations of students, if you build a soup kitchen that feeds the hungry long after you are dust, then you have truly mattered. You've changed the world in a way that outlasts your own mortality. This is available to all of us, not just the powerful. We all make choices about how we use whatever resources and influence we have. Do we use them only for ourselves? Or do we build something that will serve others after we are gone? Do we consume or do we create? Do we take or do we give? These women, despite operating in a system that gave them every reason to be selfish and short-sighted, chose to build for the future. They chose legacy over luxury. And that choice is what makes them worth remembering. Lesson 7. There are many paths to power and none of them is pure. Hürrem used love and marriage. Nurbanu used diplomacy and networks. Safiye used patience and mystique. Kösem used longevity and compassion. Turhan used strategic caution and institutional building. Mihrimah used family connections and architectural patronage. None of these paths was morally pure. All of them involved compromises, sacrifices, and probably things these women were not proud of. But all of them worked, at least for a time. There is no one right way to navigate a system that is fundamentally unjust. You use the tools available to you. You make the alliances you can make. You take the opportunities that present themselves. You do what you must to survive and, if you are fortunate and skilled, to thrive. Judging these women for the choices they made is easy from our comfortable distance. But they lived in a world of real constraints and real dangers. They did what they needed to do, and they accomplished extraordinary things despite those constraints. So when you find yourself in a difficult situation in a system that seems designed to limit you, remember these women. Remember that there is always a way forward, even if it is not the path you would choose in an ideal world. Remember that surviving is not the same as surrendering. Remember that working within a system to gain power is not the same as endorsing that system. You can play the game and still hate the rules. You can succeed in a broken system while working to fix it. You can compromise on tactics while never compromising on your ultimate goals. These women did it, in a time and place that was far more restrictive than most of us will ever face. They found paths to power. They used that power for good as well as for their own advancement. They left legacies that endure. If they could do it then, what can we do now? That is the question their stories leave us with. Not a simple answer, but a challenge. A reminder that power is always available to those creative and determined enough to seize it. That systems can be navigated even when they cannot be broken. That individual brilliance, while not sufficient for systemic change, is still valuable and important, and capable of making real differences in real people's lives. These women were not perfect. They were not saints, but they were remarkable, and their stories deserve to be remembered not as exotic tales from a distant past, but as lessons for navigating the complicated, unjust, opportunity-filled world we still inhabit today. So as you drift towards sleep, think about the woman you want to be. Think about the legacy you want to leave. Think about the systems you navigate and the choices you make within those systems. Think about education and networks and patience and compassion and ruthlessness and the many complicated facets of being human in a world that tries to limit us. And remember that history is full of people who started with nothing and built something extraordinary, who played games they did not design and won anyway, who left marks on the world that time cannot erase. You're part of that same story. Your struggles are different but related. Your challenges are real but not insurmountable. And the choices you make today will echo into a future you cannot see, shaping lives you will never know, creating legacies you cannot predict. Make them count. Rest peacefully now, my friends, because when we continue one final time, we are going to bring this long journey to a close. We are going to step back and see the whole picture, from the captured slave girl with red hair to the mosques that still stand today. We are going to reflect on what it all means, why these stories matter, and what strange gifts this history offers us as we face our own uncertain futures. Sleep well, for one last chapter remains, and it is waiting for you in the quiet darkness. We have travelled a long way together tonight, from the training grounds of the Harem to the throne rooms of empire, from captivity to power, from nothing to everything. And now, as our journey comes to an end, I want to leave you with one final thought about why these stories matter, because here is the strange truth. The Ottoman harem was both more restrictive and more liberating than we usually imagine. And holding both of those facts in your mind at the same time is how you actually understand what happened. Yes, these women were enslaved. They were captured, bought, and sold like property. They had no choice about entering the system. They were confined to specific spaces, veiled in public, limited in ways that men never were. The system was fundamentally unjust, built on slavery and patriarchy and rigid hierarchies. All of that is true. And yet, within that unjust system, these women found paths to power that most European women of the same era could never access. A peasant girl in France had essentially no chance of influencing national policy, but a captured girl in the Ottoman Empire, if she was smart and determined and lucky, could become the power behind the throne, could correspond with foreign queens, could build monuments that would stand for centuries, could actually rule an empire even if she could not sit on the throne herself. Both of these things are true. The system was oppressive and the women were powerful. They were victims and they were rulers. They were confined and they were influential beyond measure. This is what makes history so much richer than our simple narratives allow. Real life is complicated. People are contradictory. Systems have loopholes and exceptions that do not fit our neat categories of good and bad, oppressed and free. And these women exploited every loophole they could find. They took a system designed to control them and turned it into a ladder. They took roles meant to be decorative and made them powerful. They took limitations and transformed them into opportunities. Was this liberation? Not in any complete sense. They were still operating within massive constraints. They still could not do many things that men took for granted. The system still fundamentally advantaged men over women, but it was also not complete oppression, because true oppression leaves no room for agency at all. And these women had agency. They made choices. They pursued strategies. They won and lost and adapted and survived. They were players in the game, not just pieces on the board. And I think this is actually a useful framework for thinking about our own lives, because most of us are not living in perfectly just systems either. We all navigate structures that limit us in various ways, based on gender, race, class, nationality, disability, or any number of other categories. We all face constraints we did not choose and cannot completely escape. The question is, what do we do with the space we have? Do we focus only on the constraints, on everything we cannot do, on how unfair the system is? Or do we also look for the loopholes, the opportunities, the ways we can build power even within limitation? I think these Ottoman women would tell us to do both. Recognize the injustice, never pretend it does not exist, never stop pushing against it, but also work with what you have. Use the tools available to you. Build networks. Get educated. Be patient. Choose your battles. Create things that will last. It is not either or. It is both and. Now let us talk about what happened after the Sultanate of Women ended. Because the story does not really stop in 1683 with Turhan's death. Women continued to be important in Ottoman politics. There were other Valide Sultans who wielded significant influence, but the era of women as dominant powers, as de facto rulers, as regents for decades, that era was over. Why? What changed? I think several factors came together. First, sultans started taking the throne at older ages, so there were fewer child rulers who needed regents. Second, the Grand Viziers and other male officials had learned from the Sultanate of Women. They had seen how powerful women could become, and that they put structures in place to prevent it from happening again. They limited the Valide Sultan's access to certain meetings. They reduced the budgets available to royal women. They created new rules about how long a Valide could serve as regent. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the empire itself was changing. The 17th century saw the beginning of Ottoman decline, or at least the end of Ottoman expansion. The empire faced more external threats, more internal rebellions, more economic challenges. In that context, there was pressure to centralize power in more traditional military-focused leadership. Women's power, which had thrived during a certain kind of stability, became less viable in crisis. So the system closed the loophole, the exception became impossible again, and women's influence, while still real, returned to more traditional channels. Is this depressing? Yes. It shows how fragile progress can be, how easily gains can be lost, how systems reassert themselves even after extraordinary individuals push boundaries. But it also does not erase what happened during those 150 years. The Sultanate of Women was real. The power those women wielded was real. The buildings they constructed still stand, the institutions they created still function. The precedents they set cannot be completely forgotten. And here is something interesting. The memory of the Sultanate of Women influenced later movements for women's rights in the Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. When women started pushing for education and legal reforms in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they could point to this historical period and say, "See, women have held power in our society before. This is not foreign. This is part of our own tradition." Hürrem, Nurbanu, Safiye, Kösem, Turhan, they became symbols. Controversial symbols, certainly. Some people celebrated them as powerful women who should be emulated. Others criticized them as exceptions who proved the rule, as women who gained power through manipulation rather than right. But they could not be ignored. They were part of the historical record. They mattered, and they still matter today, not just in Turkey but everywhere, because their stories ask universal questions. How do you gain power in a system designed to exclude you? How do you maintain that power once you have it? What do you do with power when you get it? How do you build something that lasts beyond your own life? How do you balance self-interest with service to others? How do you survive in a world that wants to destroy you? These are not 16th century questions. These are today questions, tomorrow questions, forever questions. And the answers these women gave: educate yourself, build networks, be patient, be strategic, be ruthless when necessary, but compassionate when possible, create institutions, leave legacies. Those answers are still relevant. I started this series by telling you that the harem was not what you thought it was. That it was not a prison or a pleasure palace, but a school and a political institution and a ladder to power. And I hope after all these hours together you see that now. You see the complexity. You see the women not as victims or villains, but as human beings navigating impossible situations with creativity and determination. They were not perfect. They made choices we might not agree with. They hurt people. They engaged in brutal political games. They worked within a fundamentally unjust system rather than trying to overthrow it. But they also built hospitals that healed the sick, fed the hungry, educated children, created beauty, wielded power with competence, shaped history, left marks on the world that time has not erased. They were complicated, like all of us, like all real people who do real things in the real world. And their stories, their strange and fascinating stories, remind us that history is never as simple as we want it to be, that progress is not linear, that systems can both oppress and create opportunity, that individuals can matter even when they cannot change everything, that power takes many forms, that legacy is a choice. As you close your eyes tonight, for the last time on this particular journey, I want you to think about one thing. Not the grand political dramas, not the palace intrigues, not even the beautiful buildings, though they are worth thinking about. I want you to think about that first moment, that moment when a terrified girl, captured, enslaved, taken from everything she knew, walked through the gates of Topkapi Palace and entered the harem. She had nothing, she knew no one. She spoke a foreign language. She had every reason to give up, to accept her fate, to live and die in obscurity. But she looked around. She paid attention. She learned. She adapted. She found allies. She discovered opportunities. She climbed. And whether that girl was Roxolana, who became Hürrem Sultan, or Cecilia, who became Nurbanu Sultan, or the Albanian girl, who became Safiye Sultan, or Anastasia, who became Kösem Sultan, or the Russian girl who became Turhan Sultan, the pattern is the same. They started with nothing and built everything. They took the worst moment of their lives, capture, enslavement, loss of identity, and transformed it into the foundation of something extraordinary. That is the lesson I want you to carry with you. Not that slavery was okay, not that patriarchy was fine, not that these systems were good, they were not, but that even in the worst systems, even in the darkest moments, even when everything is stacked against you, there is always a path forward. Always. It might be narrow, it might be dangerous, it might require sacrifices you do not want to make. But it exists, and these women found it. They walked it. They showed us the way. So whatever you're facing in your own life, whatever system is limiting you, whatever challenge seems insurmountable, whatever odds are stacked against you, remember the women of the Ottoman Harem. Remember that they started as slaves and died as rulers. Remember that they had no rights and yet wielded enormous power. Remember they were confined to palaces but shaped empires. Remember that they did the impossible, which means the impossible is possible. It will not be easy. It might not even be fair. You might have to be smarter, tougher, more patient, more strategic than the people who start with advantages you never had. You might have to work twice as hard for half the recognition, but it can be done. They proved it. 500 years ago, in a time and place far more restrictive than most of us will ever face, they proved it. And their proof, built in stone and policy and diplomatic letters and charitable institutions, is still here, still standing, still teaching us, still showing us what is possible when brilliance meets determination, when intelligence meets opportunity, when extraordinary individuals refuse to accept the limitations that society tries to impose. Sleep well, my friends. Dream of marble courtyards and soaring domes. Dream of women who walked through fire and came out the other side wearing crowns. Dream of power seized and wielded and transformed into something beautiful and lasting. And when you wake, remember their stories, remember their strategies, remember their courage, remember that they were real women who faced real challenges and found real solutions. Remember that if they could change their world, you can change yours. Thank you for walking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these stories with open minds and hearts. Thank you for allowing these remarkable women back into the light after so many years in the shadows of history. I hope their tales have given you something, whether it is inspiration or knowledge, or simply a few hours of peace as you drifted towards sleep. These stories are a gift, a strange gift from the past, wrapped in complexity and contradiction, but a gift nonetheless, and I am grateful to have been able to share them with you. If you enjoyed this journey through Ottoman history, please let me know in the comments. Tell me which woman's story resonated with you most. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what you learned. And if you want more stories like this, more deep dives into forgotten history, more tales of remarkable people who changed the world in unexpected ways, please subscribe and stay with me. Because history is full of these stories, full of people we have forgotten or never knew, full of lessons we have not learned, full of wisdom waiting to be rediscovered. And I want to keep finding them, keep telling them, keep bringing them to you in the quiet hours when you need something to help you rest, to help you think, to help you dream. Until we meet again, sleep peacefully. May your dreams be full of beauty and power and possibility. May you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges await you. And may you carry with you always the knowledge that ordinary people, people like you, like me, like these captured girls who became empresses, can do extraordinary things. The Ottoman Harem taught us that. The women who lived there proved it, and their legacy lives on in the buildings they built, in the stories we tell, and in every person who hears those stories and thinks, if they could do it, maybe I can too. Good night, my friends, and thank you for everything.